Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never been the type to share personal stuff online, but I need to get this off my chest. What happened that night in '69 has been eating at me for decades. I've told a few people over the years, but most just give me that look. You know the one. But I know what I saw. It was January 1969, dead of winter in British Columbia. My sister Marie, my buddy Dave and I were driving back from Vancouver to our hometown near Prince George. We'd gone down for a concert, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and were making the long drive back through the night because Dave and I both had work the next day. It must have been around 3 a.m. when we were passing through the stretch near Hope. If you know that area, you know how remote it gets. The Trans-Canada Highway cuts through mountains and forests, and in January of '69, that road was barely maintained compared to now. We were in my '64 Chevy Impala, not the fanciest car, but reliable enough, and the heater worked, which was all that mattered that night. Man, the cold. That's something I still remember vividly. The radio had said it was dropping to 40 with the wind chill. The kind of cold where your breath freezes in your beard, where the air itself feels brittle. We had the heater cranked full blast, but still kept our coats on. Marie had fallen asleep in the back seat around Chilliwack. Dave was fighting to stay awake in the passenger seat, half-heartedly keeping me company. I was tired too, but the driving kept me alert enough. The road was empty, hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. Just the twin beams of my headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the occasional reflective marker at the edge of the road, and the wall of pine trees on either side. I remember I was thinking about work, mentally preparing for the shift I'd have to pull in just a few hours when it happened. Something moved at the edge of the trees to the right of the road. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks. You know how your mind starts to wander when you're tired. But then it stepped onto the road. I hit the brakes instinctively, not hard enough to skid on the icy road, but enough that Dave jolted forward and Marie stirred in the back. "What's wrong?" Dave asked, suddenly alert. I couldn't answer. My hands were frozen to the steering wheel, eyes fixed on what was illuminated in my headlights. It was walking across the road, right in front of us, maybe 50 feet ahead. Not running, not hurrying, just walking with these long, deliberate strides. This wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. It was huge. Had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The torso was massive, barrel-shaped, covered in what looked like thick, greyish-brown hair, or fur. Not a coat, actual hair. The arms were what really got me. They hung way too low, almost to the knees, swinging with each step in this fluid, powerful way. Dave saw it too. "Holy shit," he whispered. "Holy shit." Marie was still half asleep. "Why are we stopping?" she mumbled from the back. "Look," was all I could say. The thing was in full view now, completely illuminated by my headlights. It was crossing from right to left, and for what must have been about 6 seconds, we had a perfect view of it. The legs were thick like tree trunks, also covered in that same greyish-brown hair. It walked upright, completely bipedal, but not like a person mimicking an ape. This was its natural gait. Powerful, efficient, with a slight forward lean. Then it did something I'll never forget. About halfway across the road, it turned toward us, but not like how you or I would turn our head to look at something. This thing rotated its entire upper body. The head didn't seem to have much of a neck. It was sort of sunk into those massive shoulders. The face was, God, it's hard to describe even now. The forehead sloped back sharply from heavy brow ridges. In the harsh light of the headlights, I could make out dark eye sockets, a wide, flat nose, and a jaw that jutted forward slightly. It looked at us for maybe 3 strides, then rotated its torso forward again and continued across the road with that same unhurried pace until it disappeared into the trees on the other side. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 10 seconds, but it's burned into my memory like a photograph. For several moments after it vanished, none of us said anything. The car idled on the empty road, headlights illuminating nothing but pavement and falling snow. Marie was fully awake now, leaning between the front seats. What was that?" she asked, her voice small. Dave turned to me, his face pale in the dim light of the dashboard. "You saw that, right? Tell me you saw that." "I saw it," I said. My mouth had gone completely dry. Slowly I eased my foot back onto the gas. Part of me wanted to turn around and head back toward Hope, away from whatever territory we'd just entered, but another part reasoned that whatever it was had crossed from right to left, so continuing forward was actually taking us away from it. "Should we report it or something?" Marie asked from the back seat. Dave gave a shaky laugh. "Report what? To who? That we saw a Sasquatch? They'd think we were drunk or crazy." "That wasn't a bear," I said firmly. "Bears don't walk like that. And it wasn't a person in a costume either." "In this weather," Dave added. -40 out there. And who'd be out here at 3 a.m. in a monkey suit? There's nothing around for miles. No houses, no cabins, nothing. We drove in silence for a while, each processing what we'd seen. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that we'd witnessed something impossible. The way it moved was so natural, so suited to its body. No human could mimic that gait, that posture. The proportions were all wrong. Those long arms, that barrel chest, and the way it turned. Humans can't rotate their upper bodies like that while walking. We're not built that way. It looked like one of those recreations of Neanderthals at the museum, I said finally, but bigger, much bigger. Neanderthals are extinct, Marie said quietly, have been for thousands of years. I know what they tell us, I replied, but I also know what I just saw. We drove on through the night, constantly scanning the tree line on both sides of the road. Every shadow seemed threatening now. That brief glimpse had fundamentally changed how we perceived the forest around us. It wasn't empty anymore. Something was out there, something that shouldn't exist. About 20 minutes later, we passed through a small town, just a gas station, a diner, and a few houses. The diner's lights were on despite the hour, a truck stop for long-haul drivers. I pulled in without discussing it with the others. We all knew we needed to stop, to be around other people for a bit. Inside, there were just 2 truckers at the counter and a tired-looking waitress refilling their coffee. The fluorescent lighting and smell of bacon grease felt absurdly normal after what we'd just experienced. We took a booth by the window, ordered coffee and pie none of us would touch, and tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Maybe it was some kind of bear with mange, Marie suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Dave shook his head. Bears don't walk like that, not on 2 legs for that distance. Could have been a hoax, I said, though I didn't believe it. Someone playing a prank. Dave looked at me. In the middle of nowhere, at 3 a.m., in 40 weather, who would go to those lengths for a prank no one would even see? He was right. The location made no sense for a hoax. That stretch of highway was completely deserted at that hour, especially in January. The chances of someone setting up there on the off chance a car might come by were practically 0. We should report it, Marie said again. To who? Dave asked. The police. Excuse me, officer, we'd like to report a Bigfoot sighting. They'll think we were high. We weren't, I said firmly. And we all saw it. That's the thing. We all saw exactly the same thing. We fell silent as the waitress brought our order. I remember watching her hands as she set down the cups, thinking how small and delicate human hands looked compared to those massive limbs I'd just seen swinging through my headlights. Do you get many wildlife sightings around here? Marie asked the waitress. The woman shrugged. Bears in the summer, couple moose now and then. Why, you folks see something? We exchanged glances. Just curious, I said. After she left, Dave leaned forward. Look, I don't know what that was, but it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, and it sure as hell wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else. Sasquatch, Marie whispered. Bigfoot. Growing up in BC, we'd all heard the stories. The indigenous peoples had legends about wild men of the woods going back centuries. There had been sightings reported throughout the Pacific Northwest for decades. I'd always written them off as misidentified bears or hoaxes. Not anymore. What struck me most was how unconcerned it had seemed about us. It wasn't startled by our headlights or the car. It just glanced at us and continued on its way, like we were just another feature of the landscape not worth much attention. That's not how animals typically react to vehicles. We didn't stay long at the diner. Despite our exhaustion, we were all too keyed up to rest. Back in the car, the conversation died out as we each retreated into our thoughts. The rest of the drive passed in a kind of hyper-vigilant silence, all of us scanning the trees, half expecting to see another massive figure emerge from the darkness. We made it home just as dawn was breaking. Dave and I called in sick to work. There was no way either of us could face a normal day after what we'd seen. Marie skipped her university classes. We spent the day at my apartment, talking through the experience over and over, comparing details, making sure our memories aligned. They did, down to the smallest detail. The grayish-brown color of the hair, the way it rotated its torso, the deliberate stride. In the following weeks, I drove back to that stretch of highway twice in daylight. I don't know what I expected to find. Footprints would have been covered by snow, and I had no real tracking skills anyway. The forest looked different in daylight. Just trees and snow and occasional wildlife tracks. Normal, explainable. I never did make an official report. Who would I tell? What would I say? I didn't have proof, just my experience and the corroboration of my sister and friend. Over the years, I've told a few people, usually after a few drinks when the conversation turns to the unexplained. Some believe me, most don't. Dave moved to Toronto a few years later, but whenever we talk, the conversation eventually circles back to that night. Marie refused to talk about it after the first few months, saying it gave her nightmares. It's been over 50 years now. I've read every book on Sasquatch I could find, followed up on other sightings in BC, even joined a couple of expeditions in the 80s. Never saw anything like it again. But I know what I saw that January night in 1969. I know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, wasn't a known animal of any kind. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and pass through a particularly dense stretch of forest, I find myself scanning the tree line, not out of fear exactly, but with the knowledge that our understanding of the world is incomplete, that there are things out there living their own lives parallel to ours, rarely seen, but undeniably real. I'm an old man now, don't have many years left, but I wanted to put this experience down somewhere before I'm gone. I saw it, my sister saw it, my friend saw it. It was real, and it's still out there, somewhere in those endless forests, walking with those long, deliberate strides, turning its entire upper body when something catches its attention. Whatever you believe, the wilderness is bigger and more mysterious than we know. I learned that for certain on a frozen night in 1969, on a lonely stretch of highway near Hope. The story too. I've been holding this in for so long that it's eating me up inside. What happened back in '69 at Coots Inlet has haunted me for decades, and I think it's finally time I get it off my chest. I'm not looking for people to believe me. Honestly, I've spent years trying not to believe it myself, but I can't forget what happened that day. It was February 1969. I was 23 then, working at the aluminum plant in Kitimat, like most guys in town. British Columbia winters get damn cold. but that particular Saturday was surprisingly clear. One of those rare winter days when the clouds part and you get this crystal blue sky. My buddies Frank Denton and Mike Calhoun had been talking about taking Frank's boat out to do some fishing at Coots Inlet in the Butte Dale area. It's remote as hell, about 50 miles from the open Pacific, surrounded by dense forest that runs right up to the shoreline. The night before, we'd gotten pretty loaded at Frank's place. His wife was visiting her sister in Vancouver, so we were drinking beer and planning our trip. I remember Frank saying, "Ronnie, you bringing that shotgun of yours? Might get some ducks." I had a Remington 870 my dad had given me when I turned 18. Nothing fancy, but reliable. I agreed to bring it along, not thinking much of it. We set out early, around 5:30 a.m. The temperature was just below freezing. I remember the cold air burning my lungs as we loaded up Frank's boat, a 16-foot aluminum fishing boat with an outboard motor. Mike brought coffee in a thermos, and I had my shotgun and some shells. We weren't serious hunters, just 3 guys looking to escape town for a day. The ride out to Coots Inlet took about an hour and a half. The water was calm, but freezing. Spray from the boat would occasionally hit my face, feeling like needles on my skin. We didn't talk much on the way out. The engine was too loud, and honestly, at that hour, we were all still half asleep. Coots Inlet is this narrow strip of water that cuts into the land like a knife wound. The trees there grow huge. Old growth cedars and spruces that tower over the water. It's the kind of place that feels untouched by time. We cut the engine as we entered the inlet, using the paddle to maneuver. You could hear everything in that silence. Birds, the water lapping against the boat, the occasional splash of a fish. We'd been drifting for maybe 20 minutes when Frank whispered, "Look over there." He pointed toward the eastern shore, about 80 yards away. At first, I thought he'd spotted a bear. Black bears are common in that area, and we'd seen them before on previous trips. But what I saw wasn't a bear. Standing at the water's edge was something else. From that distance, it looked like a man, but all wrong. Too big, way too big. It was covered in dark brown, almost black hair. It stood upright on 2 legs, but there was nothing human about the way it moved. Its arms hung down almost to its knees. "What the fuck is that?" Mike whispered. His voice had this tremor I'd never heard before. Frank didn't say anything, but his knuckles were white on the fishing rod he was holding. The creature hadn't noticed us yet. It was crouched down, reaching into the water like it was trying to catch something. Fish, maybe. We watched it for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. Then Frank shifted in the boat, causing a small splash. The creature's head snapped up, looking directly at us. Even from that distance, I could feel it staring. My stomach dropped like I'd just gone over a cliff. It stood up to its full height, had to be over 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8. It just stood there watching us. None of us moved. None of us breathed. Then it let out this sound that I still hear in my nightmares. Not a roar like a bear. Not a scream like a person. Something in between. This guttural, throaty howl that echoed across the water. The hair on my neck stood up so fast it hurt. That's when I remembered the shotgun at my feet. Without thinking, and I swear to God I wasn't thinking clearly, I reached down and grabbed it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely load the shells. "Ronnie, what the hell are you doing?" Frank hissed at me. "It's coming toward us," I said. And it was. The thing had started moving along the shoreline in our direction, still watching us. It wasn't running, just this purposeful walk, pushing through the underbrush like it wasn't even there. I raised the shotgun to my shoulder. The creature stopped. For a second, we just looked at each other across the water. I swear it understood what I was holding. Its eyes, I couldn't make out the color from that distance, but they looked aware, intelligent. Then it took another step toward us, and I pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in that quiet inlet. Birds erupted from the trees all around us. The shot pattern hit the water short of the shore, sending up a spray. I chambered another round and fired again, this time aiming higher. I'll never know if I hit it. The creature let out this scream. Jesus Christ, that scream. It wasn't anger, it was pain. It clutched at its side and then turned and crashed into the forest, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. The underbrush and small trees just gave way as it plowed through them. "Holy shit, Ronnie, what the fuck?" Mike was yelling, grabbing my arm. Frank was frantically starting the outboard motor, his hands shaking so bad he could barely pull the cord. "Did you see that? Did you fucking see that?" I kept saying it over and over. My ears were ringing from the shotgun blasts. Frank got the motor started and cranked it to full throttle. We practically flew out of that inlet, not looking back. No one spoke for the entire ride back to Kitimat. What was there to say? We'd all seen it, we all knew what it looked like, but none of us wanted to be the first to say the word. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, that's what we saw. When we got back to the dock, Frank finally broke the silence. "We don't tell anyone about this," he said, his voice flat. "No one will believe us anyway." Mike nodded quickly. "I'm with Frank. This stays between us." I wanted to argue. I'd shot at the thing, maybe wounded it. Shouldn't we report that? But the look in their eyes stopped me. Fear, yes, but also this pleading. They needed to pretend this didn't happen, so I agreed. "Yeah, okay, between us." We went to Frank's place and drank until we couldn't see straight. None of us mentioned what happened at the inlet. It was like, if we didn't talk about it, maybe it didn't really happen, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, lying in bed, I kept seeing those eyes looking at me, kept hearing that scream of pain. I barely slept. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face people, couldn't make small talk knowing what I knew. Instead, I sat in my apartment and cleaned my shotgun over and over, like I could somehow clean away the memory. By Monday, I'd convinced myself that maybe we'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe the fear and distance had played tricks on our eyes. I almost believed it. Then Frank called me at home that night. "Have you been listening to the radio?" he asked, his voice tight. "No, why?" "There's been reports. Some loggers up near Butte Dale. They found blood on the ground and these huge tracks. Ronnie, they're saying it might be a wounded bear, but the tracks don't match. They're human-like." My blood went cold. "What are you saying, Frank?" "I'm saying you hit it. Whatever that thing was, you hit it." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark of my kitchen for hours. The guilt was crushing. I'd shot at a living creature without provocation. It hadn't charged us or threatened us. It was just there, and I'd shot at it. Over the next few weeks, there were more stories. Hunters reported strange sounds in the forest near Coots Inlet. A family camping about 10 miles from there swore they'd seen a massive, hair-covered figure watching them from the trees. Each story made me sink deeper into a hole of guilt and fear. Frank, Mike, and I drifted apart after that day. We'd see each other around town, nod, maybe exchange a few words, but the easy friendship was gone. What we'd experienced had put this wall between us that none of us knew how to tear down. About 6 months later, Mike moved away, took a job in Edmonton. Frank and I lost touch completely after his divorce in '71. I stayed in Kitimat until '78, when I couldn't take it anymore. The town felt too small, too close to those woods. I relocated to Vancouver and never looked back. For decades, I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was some hermit living in the woods. Maybe we were all more hungover than we realized and saw something that wasn't there. But deep down, I know what we saw. I know what I shot at. And the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night even now, is not knowing if I killed it. Did it die alone in those woods? Did it suffer? Or is it still out there carrying my buckshot in its side, remembering the humans who hurt it? I'm 77 years old now. Frank and Mike are both gone. I'm the only one left who remembers what happened at Coots Inlet in February 1969. I've never told this story to anyone before today. Not to my ex-wife, not to my children, not to the therapist I briefly saw in the 90s. It's been my secret burden to carry. But I can't take it to my grave. Someone needs to know what happened that day. Someone needs to know that there are things in this world that we can't explain, that don't fit into our neat categories of what's real and what isn't. I don't go fishing anymore. I sold that shotgun decades ago, and I've never set foot in Kitimat or anywhere near the Buttedale area since I left. Some places you don't go back to, some memories you try to bury, but they never stay buried, do they? Not really. They're always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for a quiet moment to come screaming back. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, makes no difference to me now. But if you're ever up in that part of British Columbia, maybe stay out of Coots Inlet. Some things are better left alone. And some creatures deserve to live their lives without humans barging in with guns and fear and stupid reflexive violence. I've lived with what I did for over 50 years. I'll probably die with it too. But at least now, I'm not the only one who knows. Story 3. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but I need to get it off my chest. It's been over 50 years, and I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat thinking about what I found that day. I've never been able to explain it, and honestly, I've stopped trying. Some things just don't fit into our understanding of the world. It was March 1969. I was 32 years old and had been living in my cabin near Lewis Lake up in the Powell River area of British Columbia for about 3 years by then. I'd moved there after my divorce, wanting solitude and a simpler life away from Vancouver. The cabin sat at about 6,000 feet elevation, overlooking Chickamas Valley. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom place with a small kitchen, living area with a wood stove and a covered porch. But it was mine, and I loved the isolation. That winter had been particularly brutal. We'd gotten more snow than I'd seen in my time there, over 20 feet in some drifts. By March, we still had about 17 feet of packed snow on the ground. I'd been down in Powell River for supplies, food, fuel for my generator, and some books to keep me company. I remember it was a clear day, cold but sunny, with that brilliant blue sky you only get in the mountains. I'd taken my snowmobile down and was heading back up in the early afternoon. I wanted to get back before dark. Even though I knew the trail well, nighttime in those mountains wasn't something to mess with, especially alone. The ride up was uneventful. The snowmobile was running great, and I was making good time. I remember feeling content, looking forward to a quiet evening by the fire with a hot meal and one of my new books. I parked my snowmobile in its usual spot, about 50 yards from my cabin. As I was unloading my supplies, I noticed something odd in the snowfield that stretched out behind my cabin, toward the tree line about 100 yards away. At first, I thought maybe some snow had melted in a weird pattern, creating dark spots in the otherwise pristine white surface. I put my bags on the porch and decided to check it out. As I got closer, I realized what I was seeing were tracks, footprints in the snow. But they weren't like any tracks I'd ever seen before. Now, I'd been an outdoorsman all my life, grew up hunting with my dad, spent summers working as a guide in the Rockies during college. I knew animal tracks, could identify deer, elk, moose, bear, you name it. These weren't animal tracks, at least not any animal I recognized. They were footprints, human-like footprints, but they were enormous. I'm not exaggerating when I say they were easily 18-20 inches long. And they weren't boot prints or snowshoe marks. They were bare feet, 5 toes, clear as day, pressed into the snow. My first thought was that someone was playing a joke. Maybe another cabin owner or a hiker with some weird snowshoes designed to look like feet. But as I followed the tracks for a bit, I realized 2 things that made my blood run cold. First, the stride length. I'm 6'1", and my normal walking stride is maybe 2 to 3 feet at most. These tracks were spaced about 6 feet apart. 6 feet! I tried to jump from one print to the next and couldn't come close, even with a running start. Second, these tracks were pressed into snow that was 17 feet deep. Not walking on top of it, pressed into it. Whatever made these tracks was heavy enough to compact the snow, but not so heavy that it broke through completely. And it wasn't post-holing. You know, when you walk in deep snow and sink in randomly. These were consistent, deliberate steps. I felt that sensation of the hair standing up on the back of my neck. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind in the trees, nothing. Just me and those tracks. I followed them for about a quarter mile. They came from the north, passed behind my cabin about 50 yards back, and continued south toward the valley. The tracks never changed. Same size, same stride length, same five-toed print. Whatever made them was consistent in its movement, not hurrying, not slowing down. I noticed something else too. There was no drag mark between the prints. When humans walk in deep snow, there's usually a bit of a trench that forms as we drag our feet slightly forward for the next step. These tracks were just clean impressions, as if whatever made them had lifted its feet, completely clear of the snow surface with each step. I had my camera in the cabin and ran back to get it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate it, but I managed to take several photos. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation, but my mind was racing with other possibilities, none of them comforting. The sun was starting to get lower in the sky, and a primal part of my brain was screaming at me to get inside. I took a few more pictures, then hurried back to my cabin. I brought in all my supplies in one trip, not wanting to make multiple trips outside, as I normally would. I locked the door, something I rarely did up there, and drew all the curtains. That night was the longest of my life. I kept the fire going and sat with my rifle across my lap. Every creak of the cabin settling, every whistle of wind made me jump. I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks and what could have made them. I've spent plenty of nights alone in the wilderness. I'm not someone who scares easily. But there was something about those tracks that struck a deep, primal chord of fear in me. It wasn't just their size or the impossible stride length. It was the casual way they passed by my cabin, as if whatever made them had been walking this route for years, long before I built my little home there, as if I was the intruder, not it. At one point in the night, around 2 a.m., I heard something outside, a heavy crunching in the snow, slow and deliberate. It circled the cabin once, pausing occasionally. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, my rifle aimed at the door. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sounds moved away, fading into the distance. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. I cautiously went outside, rifle ready. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, not much, maybe an inch or two, but enough to partially fill in the tracks from yesterday. But there were new ones too. The same massive footprints, this time circling my cabin exactly where I'd heard the sounds in the night. I followed them to where they led, away from the cabin, heading north this time. They continued for as far as I could see before disappearing into the tree line. I didn't follow them further. Some instinct told me not to. I packed a bag, locked up the cabin, and took my snowmobile back down to Powell River that morning. I told a few trusted friends what I'd seen. Some thought I was pulling their leg. Others suggested a bear walking on its hind legs. But bears don't leave five-toed human-like prints, and they certainly don't have a 6-foot stride. One old-timer at the local diner got real quiet when I described what I'd found. He asked me exactly where my cabin was, and when I told him, he nodded slowly. "That's old Sasquatch territory," he said. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the giant people who lived up in those mountains before the white man came. Said they mostly kept to themselves, but didn't take kindly to folks building in certain areas. I'd heard Sasquatch stories before, of course. Everyone in the Pacific Northwest has. But I'd always written them off as campfire tales or misidentified bears. Now, I wasn't so sure. I stayed in town for 3 days before working up the courage to return to my cabin. When I did, the tracks were gone, filled in by new snow and wind. Part of me was relieved, But another part wanted proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The photos I'd taken showed the tracks clearly, but I never shared them widely. In the few instances I did show them to people, the reactions ranged from fascination to dismissal to genuine fear. A wildlife biologist from Vancouver looked at them and simply shook his head, saying he had no explanation but advised me to be careful. I stayed in that cabin for another 2 years. Never saw tracks like that again, but sometimes at night, especially during winter storms, I'd hear heavy footsteps circling the cabin. Never saw what made them, never wanted to. Eventually, I moved back to civilization, took a job in Campbell River, met someone new, started over. But I've never forgotten those tracks, or the feeling of being watched that stayed with me as long as I lived in that cabin. I've read about other sightings over the years. The Patterson-Gimlin film had come out just a couple of years before my experience. Some reports matched elements of what I saw. The 5-toed prints, the impossible stride length. Others seemed like obvious hoaxes or misidentifications. All I know is what I saw that March day in 1969. Tracks in the snow that defied explanation. Tracks made by something that could walk through 17 feet of snow with a stride length no human could match. Something that circled my cabin in the dead of night, perhaps curious about the human who had built a home in its territory. I'm an old man now, and I've never had another experience like that one. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the isolation and the harsh winter played tricks on my mind. But then I remember the photos, long since lost in a move. The precise impressions of those 5-toed feet, and that feeling of ancient, watchful presence in the forest. Whatever was up there in those mountains near Lewis Lake, it was real. And I suspect it's still there, walking those same routes, leaving tracks for other solitary cabin dwellers to find and question. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some territories aren't meant to be claimed by man. I've never told this story publicly before, never seen the point. But as I get older, I find myself wanting to put it out there just to see if anyone else has experienced something similar in that area. Not for validation, I know what I saw, but because sometimes I still wake up hearing those heavy footsteps in the snow, and I wonder if it's still out there, making its rounds through the deep winter snow of the Pacific Northwest. Is this? Story 4. Undyne, I've never been the type to believe in cryptids or monsters or whatever you want to call them. I'm more of a see it to believe it guy, which is why what happened back in January 2003 has messed with my head for so long. I was 19 then, and my buddy Aaron and I were visiting my Uncle Rick's place out in the sticks of Jasper County, Texas. Just a weekend trip to get away from college stress, drink some beers where nobody would bother us, and hang out somewhere without neighbors breathing down our necks. Uncle Rick's house was this old single-story ranch-style place set back from the main road with about 2 acres of cleared yard and dense pine forest surrounding the rest. He'd inherited it from my grandparents and kept it as a weekend retreat since he worked in Houston. It wasn't fancy, just wooden siding painted a faded blue, a wraparound porch with mismatched furniture, and enough space inside for a few people to crash comfortably. The isolation was the selling point. Nearest neighbor was almost half a mile away. We arrived Friday afternoon with a cooler full of cheap beer and plans to do absolutely nothing productive. Uncle Rick was cool like that. He basically told us to make ourselves at home while he tinkered with his old Ford truck in the detached garage. The first night was uneventful. We grilled some burgers, watched a basketball game on his ancient TV, and crashed early. The next day, January 18th, is when everything happened. We'd spent most of the day just goofing off, taking turns shooting at cans with Uncle Rick's .22 rifle, safely in the backyard with a proper backstop, and later playing darts on the back porch. It was one of those crystal clear winter nights in Texas, cold but not freezing, maybe low 40s, with a sky so clear you could see every star. Around 9:30 p.m., we were in the middle of a game, when Aaron suddenly pointed up at the sky. "Dude, check that out." I looked up and saw a meteor streak across the sky, then another and another. Nothing massive, just quick flashes of light. But it was pretty cool. We decided to step off the porch into the backyard to get a better view without the porch roof blocking our sightline. We were standing there, necks craned upward, when I caught something in my peripheral vision. Something moving along the tree line at the edge of the front yard, maybe 40 yards from where we stood. At first, my brain registered it as my uncle, but something wasn't right about the silhouette or the way it moved. "Aaron," I whispered, nudging him, "look over there." We both turned our full attention to whatever was moving through the yard. The porch light from the front of the house cast just enough illumination for us to make out a figure. It was moving at a steady jog, not particularly fast, but with a weird smoothness to its gait. That's when my brain finally processed what I was actually seeing, and I felt my entire body go cold. It wasn't human, not even close, but it wasn't an animal I recognized either. The thing was about 5 feet tall. I'm 5'11", and I could tell it was considerably shorter than me, but what it lacked in height, it made up for in build. Even from that distance, I could see it was incredibly muscular, with proportions that just looked wrong. Its shoulders were impossibly wide compared to its height, and its arms hung lower than any human's should. The creature was covered in dark hair. In the low light, it looked black, but it might have been a very dark brown. The hair wasn't super long or shaggy like you see in those classic Bigfoot drawings. It was more like a dense coat, maybe 2 to 3 inches long, covering most of its body. But I could clearly see that its face, chest, stomach, and the insides of its arms were lighter colored, maybe even bare skin. For a few seconds, I couldn't even speak. Aaron grabbed my arm so hard it left marks, his fingers digging into my bicep. "What the fuck is that?" he hissed, his voice barely audible. The creature must have heard us or sensed our presence somehow, because it suddenly slowed its pace. Then, and this is the part that still gives me nightmares, it turned its head toward us while still moving forward. Its face, Jesus. Its face was small compared to its blocky head, with these tiny dark eyes that somehow caught the light from the porch. Its nose was turned up slightly, almost like a boxer dog's, and its forehead protruded slightly. I couldn't make out its mouth clearly, but the whole face had this expression of intelligence. Not animal curiosity, but actual awareness. It stared right at us for what was probably only 3 to 4 seconds, but felt like an eternity. We stared back, completely frozen. Then, without any warning, the thing just took off. When I say it ran fast, I mean it moved faster than anything I've ever seen. No human could run that fast, not even close. It was there 1 second, and then it was just gone, disappearing into the tree line on the other side of the property. The whole sighting probably lasted less than 15 seconds total. As soon as it vanished, Aaron and I both started talking at once, our voices overlapping as we tried to process what we'd just witnessed. "Did you fucking see that?" Aaron kept saying, over and over. "We need to go inside," I said, already backing toward the porch. "Right now!" We practically ran back into the house, slamming and locking the door behind us. Uncle Rick was in the living room watching TV and looked up, startled by our entrance. "What's got you boys spooked?" he asked, muting the television. We told him what we'd seen, talking over each other, probably sounding completely insane. I expected him to laugh or tell us we'd been drinking too much, but instead his face got really serious. "Where exactly did you see it?" he asked, standing up. We described the location and the direction it had run. Uncle Rick walked to the window and peered out into the darkness for a long moment before closing the curtains tight. "I've never seen anything myself," he said slowly, "but there's been incidents." He went on to tell us about strange things that had happened since he'd owned the property. Large tree limbs that had struck his house, thrown from impossible distances where no person could have been standing. chairs on his back porch that he'd find knocked over or sometimes thrown against his door. Once, he said, something had chased him through the woods behind his house. Something large that moved through the underbrush faster than he could run. He'd never caught a glimpse of what it was, just heard it crashing behind him. Most of the old-timers around here have stories, he said. They don't talk about them much with outsiders, but if you get them drinking, they'll tell you about things they've seen in these woods. We spent the next couple hours sitting in the living room, all the curtains drawn, jumpy at every sound from outside. Uncle Rick got his shotgun from the closet and set it next to his chair, just in case. I don't think any of us really believed the thing would try to get in the house, but the gun was reassuring nonetheless. The longer we sat there, the more details I remembered about the creature. Its chest had been massive and flat, not tapering at the waist like a human's. Its thighs were huge, like a bodybuilder's, but proportionally even larger, and its arms. They hung down almost to its knees when it was jogging. There was one other thing that hit me as we sat there, a detail my brain had registered, but I hadn't consciously processed until later. The smell. Right after it ran past, there had been this distinct odor that wafted toward us, like a wet dog that had been sprayed by a skunk, musky, wild, and distinctly unpleasant. The smell had only lasted a moment, but it was unmistakable. Around midnight, we heard something moving around outside, heavy footsteps on the gravel driveway, then silence, then what sounded like something being dragged across the front porch. Uncle Rick stood up with his shotgun, but none of us were brave enough to actually open the door and check. By morning, whatever had been out there was gone. In the daylight, we found one of the porch chairs overturned and what looked like scratch marks on the wooden railing. They could have been there before. None of us had paid that much attention to the condition of the porch railings the day before, but they looked fresh, the wood pale where the outer layer had been scraped away. Aaron and I had planned to stay until Sunday afternoon, but we packed up and left right after breakfast. Uncle Rick didn't try to convince us to stay longer. I think he was relieved to have us go. One less thing to worry about if whatever it was came back. On the drive home, Aaron and I tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. But bears don't have that body shape, and they definitely don't run with that kind of speed or smoothness. A person in a costume. The movements were too natural, too fluid, and again, no human could run that fast. Some kind of escaped exotic pet, like a chimp. Wrong size, wrong proportions. We eventually settled on the explanation that made the least sense, but somehow fit the best. We had seen some kind of Bigfoot. Not the 8-foot giant from the Patterson-Gimlin film that everyone thinks of, but something smaller, younger maybe, something that until that night I would have sworn didn't exist. Aaron and I promised each other we'd go back sometime with a camera, try to document it if we could, but we never did. Life got busy. We graduated college, moved to different cities. Uncle Rick sold the property a few years later after a divorce left him strapped for cash. I've only been back to Jasper County once since then for a cousin's wedding, and I made damn sure to stay in town, not anywhere near those woods. I still think about that night often. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, how it seemed to assess us before deciding we weren't a threat or weren't worth the trouble. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if my memory has distorted what was actually just a weird-looking person trespassing on my uncle's property. But then I remember Aaron's fingers digging into my arm, the absolute terror in his voice. I remember Uncle Rick's face when we told him, the lack of surprise, the resignation. And I remember that smell, that distinctive primal odor that triggered something deep in my brain, some ancient warning system telling me I was in the presence of something not quite human. I don't know what we saw that night in January 2003. I don't have a neat explanation, and I certainly don't have proof. All I know is that I can't look at the woods the same way anymore, especially at night. There are things out there that don't fit into our understanding of the world, things that move through the darkness just beyond our perception, and sometimes, if you're in the wrong place at the right time, you catch a glimpse of them, and once you do, you can never unsee it. Story 5. I've never really told many people about what happened that winter day back in 1983. Not because I don't remember it clearly. Trust me, I do. But because most folks just look at you funny or laugh it off. But it happened. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes, and no amount of logical explanations will ever convince me otherwise. I was 11 years old, spending Christmas break at my aunt and uncle's place in Bionate, Texas. If you've never heard of Bionate, I'm not surprised. It's barely a dot on the map, tucked away in the East Texas pine woods, where things get real rural real quick. My cousin Bobby was 12, just a year older than me, and we were thick as thieves that winter. It was early January, probably around the 5th or 6th. The weather was unusually mild that day, one of those random warm spells that sometimes breaks up a Texas winter. Must have been close to 65 degrees, which is why we were sitting out on the front porch after lunch instead of being cooped up inside. The sky was clear blue, not a cloud in sight. Perfect visibility. Aunt Jean had made us bologna sandwiches, and we were just sitting there on the porch steps, eating and talking about normal kid stuff, probably Star Wars or something. I remember the sandwich was kinda dry, and I was wishing I'd asked for more mayo. It's weird, the little details that stick with you. From the porch, we had a clear view across this big open field that stretched maybe 300 yards to the woods on the far side. There was an old barbed wire fence running through the middle of it, separating my uncle's property from the neighbor's land. Nobody really used that field for much. It was just tall grass with patches of weeds and wildflowers, even in January. I was in the middle of telling Bobby about this new BMX bike I was saving up for when he suddenly went quiet. I glanced over and noticed his eyes were fixed on something in the distance. I followed his gaze across the field, and that's when I saw it. Coming out from the tree line on the left side of the field was something. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it, maybe a person. But even from that distance, I could tell it was way too big to be just some guy. And the way it moved, there was nothing human about it. It was running. No, not running exactly. It was like covering ground in these powerful strides, moving way faster than a person could. The thing was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, and covered in dark brown hair or fur that looked matted in places, not like a costume, like actual fur that belonged on this thing. The hair moved naturally with each stride. Bobby whispered, "What the hell is that?" His voice was shaking. I couldn't even answer. My sandwich fell out of my hand onto the dirt. My whole body went cold despite the warm day. The creature was about halfway across the field when it suddenly turned its head toward our direction. I don't know if it saw us or heard us, but in that moment, I swear it looked right at us. Even from 150 yards away, I could feel it. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I remember thinking it looked almost aware. Not like an animal, but not like a person either. Then came the moment that still gives me chills to this day. This thing approached the barbed wire fence in the middle of the field, a fence that was probably 4 feet high. Without slowing down at all, it simply leapt over it. Not a running jump or a hurdle like an athlete might do. It was like the fence wasn't even there, just this smooth, powerful motion, clearing it completely without breaking stride. No hesitation, no struggle, just this incredible, fluid movement that shouldn't have been possible for something so big. After clearing the fence, it continued toward the small pond on the right side of the field. Just before it reached the tree line on the other side, there was this low-hanging branch, and I distinctly remember seeing the creature duck its head. Not stopping, just this quick, deliberate movement to avoid hitting the branch. That detail stuck with me because it showed awareness, intelligence. It wasn't just some animal running blindly. And then it was gone, disappeared into the woods on the far side of the field. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds, but it felt like time had slowed down. For a minute afterward, Bobby and I just sat there in complete silence. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. My hands were shaking. I felt cold sweat on my back despite the mild day. Finally, Bobby spoke up. "Did you see that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yeah," was all I could manage to say back. My mouth had gone completely dry. We debated what to do. Should we go look for tracks? Should we tell the adults? In the end, our curiosity wasn't strong enough to overcome our fear. There was no way in hell either of us was going to cross that field to look for evidence. We ran back inside and found my aunt in the kitchen washing dishes. Words tumbled out of both of us at once, talking over each other, trying to explain what we'd seen. I remember her face, first confused, then concerned, then settling into that expression adults get when they think kids are making things up. "It was probably just a bear," she said, drying her hands on a dish towel. "They come down from the woods sometimes." "It wasn't a bear," Bobby insisted. "It was walking on 2 legs. It jumped the fence without even touching it." My uncle came in from the back room, wanting to know what all the commotion was about. When we told him, he exchanged this look with my aunt that I couldn't quite read. "There aren't any bears around here that big," I argued. "And bears don't run on 2 legs across whole fields." My uncle sat down at the kitchen table and motioned for us to join him. "Look, boys," he said in that serious grown-up voice. "There's a lot of woods around here, deep woods that go on for miles. Not many people go out there, especially not in the back acres past the Henderson property. I'm not saying what you saw was or wasn't anything in particular, but I will say this. There are things in those woods that most folks in town don't talk about much." My aunt shot him a look. "Don't fill their heads with nonsense, Frank." But there was something in my uncle's eyes. He wasn't just humoring us. Later that evening, I overheard him talking to my dad on the phone. I couldn't make out everything, but I caught phrases like, "The boys saw something out by the east field," and "Not the first time people have reported," before my aunt noticed me listening and shooed me away. That night, Bobby and I shared the guest room. Neither of us could sleep. We kept the windows shut tight, even though the room was stuffy. Every crack of a branch outside made us both freeze. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, replaying what I'd seen over and over. "You think it'll come to the house?" Bobby whispered around midnight. "No," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "If it wanted to, it would have already." The next morning, Bobby wanted to go check for tracks, but an unexpected cold front had moved in overnight, bringing a light dusting of snow that would have covered any evidence. Part of me was relieved. I wasn't sure I wanted confirmation. For days afterward, I jumped at every sound when I was outside. I kept scanning the tree line whenever I was in view of the woods. The rest of my stay in Bionate passed without incident, but something had fundamentally changed in how I saw those woods. They weren't just trees anymore. They were hiding places, places where things I couldn't explain could be watching and waiting. When I went back home to Houston a week later, I tried telling a couple of friends at school, but they just laughed it off. "Bigfoot? For real? What were you smoking out there in the sticks?" After a while, I just stopped talking about it. Years later, when Bobby and I were in high school, we finally talked about it again. We were at a family reunion, and we snuck off to the creek behind my grandparents' place. It was the first time we'd really discussed it since it happened. "You still remember that thing we saw at my parents' place?" he asked out of nowhere. "Like it was yesterday," I admitted. "Me too." He skipped a rock across the water. "I looked it up, you know. There've been other sightings around Bionate. Not many, but some. Most people don't report it officially because they don't want to be labeled as crazy." I nodded. "You ever tell anyone else?" Tried once. Girl I was dating sophomore year. She thought I was making it up to impress her or something. He laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. You? Nah, what's the point? Nobody believes this stuff unless they've seen it themselves. We compared our memories that day, and they matched up almost perfectly. The size of the creature, the color, how it moved, the way it jumped that fence without breaking stride, how it ducked under that branch. The fact that our recollections were so similar after all those years only convinced me more that what we'd seen was real. I went back to Bionate a few times over the years. My aunt and uncle sold that property when I was in college and moved closer to Dallas to be near their grandkids. The last time I visited the old place, the new owners had cleared most of the field and built a workshop where we'd seen the creature disappear into the trees. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, or if there are others like it. I wonder if those woods in East Texas hold more secrets than most people realize. I never did go into those deep woods alone after that day. Even now, at 51 years old, I get an uneasy feeling when I'm in dense forest by myself. That feeling of being watched never quite goes away. I know what I saw that January day in 1983. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a guy in a costume. It wasn't my imagination. It was something that shouldn't exist according to science books and rational thinking, but it does. I've made my peace with the fact that most people will never believe me, and that's fine. But every now and then, when I see news reports of similar sightings or hear stories from rural areas about strange encounters in the woods, I think back to that creature crossing the field with those powerful strides, effortlessly jumping that fence, and I know I'm not alone in what I've experienced. The world is stranger than most people are willing to admit. I learned that lesson early, on a warm January day in East Texas, sitting on a porch with a bologna sandwich in my hand, watching something impossible run across a field in broad daylight. Story 6. I've gone back and forth about posting this for years. I'm not the type of person who believes in weird stuff. My husband and I have a small property about 20 miles outside of Jasper, Texas, where we've lived for nearly 15 years. We're practical people. I work as an office manager at a medical clinic, and my husband repairs farm equipment. Nothing extraordinary about us. What happened that morning in March 2014 changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Sometimes I wake up at night wondering if what I saw was real, but I know it was. I know what I saw. It was a Wednesday morning around 5:40 a.m. I remember because I had to be at work early that day to prepare for a staff meeting. It was still dark out, with just that faint blue pre-dawn light starting to appear. The kind of light where you can see shapes but not much detail. I'd made my coffee, kissed my sleeping husband goodbye, and headed out to my Subaru. The drive to work is about 35 minutes, mostly along County Road 32. It's a quiet, winding road through pine forests, beautiful during the day but eerie in the dark. I've driven it so many times I could probably do it blindfolded. That morning was chilly, around 40 degrees. I had the heat on and was listening to the morning news on the radio. I'd driven about 10 minutes from our house when something caught my eye ahead. At first, I thought someone had abandoned an ATV or some kind of wide equipment on the road. It was just a dark shape, broader than a person. My headlights weren't quite reaching it yet, and in that dim morning light, all I could make out was a dark silhouette maybe 100 yards ahead. I slowed down, thinking it might be a broken-down vehicle. We help each other out around here. That's just what you do in rural areas. As I got closer, maybe 75 yards away, the shape moved. It shifted to the right side of the road toward the ditch. I remember feeling relieved that it wasn't a stalled vehicle blocking the road. I kept driving, slowing down to maybe 35 maximum. I figured it was probably a deer or maybe a wild hog. We get both around here, and they can cause serious accidents. But something felt off about the movement. It wasn't the quick, nervous motion of a deer. It was deliberate. When I was about 40 yards away, my headlights finally illuminated whatever it was. It had moved to the side of the road and was bent over in the ditch, kind of hunched down. I remember thinking it looked like someone in dark clothes, searching for something they'd dropped. It was big, though, too big to be a normal person. And then, as I got within 25 yards, it stood up. My blood ran cold. This thing, and I don't know what else to call it, unfolded itself from its crouched position and stood fully upright. It was massive, taller than any man I've ever seen, at least 7 feet, maybe 8 feet tall. Broad shoulders, thick body, covered in black hair, not fur like a bear, hair, shaggy, long black hair. I instinctively hit the brakes. My car slowed almost to a stop. I was maybe 20 yards away from it now. It turned, not its head, but its entire upper body, and looked directly at me. I couldn't make out facial features clearly in my headlights, just that it had a face darker than the hair, and that it was looking at me. For a split second, we just stared at each other. My hands were frozen on the steering wheel. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a person in a costume. It wasn't a bear. It moved too naturally, too smoothly. Then, in one fluid motion, it turned away from me, lifted its right leg high. I clearly saw the knee bend, saw the shape of a massive foot, and stepped over a fallen log that was at least 3 feet high. Then it disappeared into the forest. The whole encounter lasted maybe 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds completely changed my life. I sat there in my idling car for a few minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I had goosebumps all over my body. Part of me wanted to turn around, go home, and crawl back into bed, but another part knew I hadn't imagined it. I drove to work in a daze. I remember pulling into the parking lot and just sitting there, staring at nothing. A co-worker tapped on my window and asked if I was okay. I said I wasn't feeling well, which was true. I felt like I was in shock. Throughout the day, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, the way it moved, the way it looked at me, the way it stepped over that log with such ease. It was so deliberate, so intelligent. That's what scared me the most. Whatever I saw, it wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. It moved with purpose. When I got home that evening, I told my husband. He's a skeptical person, even more than I was. But he could tell how shaken up I was. He asked me detailed questions, and I described everything exactly as I'd seen it. When I finished, he didn't laugh or dismiss me. He just sat there for a minute, then said, "You saw something, honey. I believe you saw something." The next day was my day off. My husband convinced me to go back to the spot with him. I was terrified, but he promised we'd stay in the truck. We drove slowly down County Road 32 until I recognized the area. The fallen log was still there, but the ground was covered in pine needles and dead leaves. My husband got out, despite my protests, and looked around for footprints or any sign of what I'd seen. But there was nothing. The forest floor was too soft and covered with too much debris to show prints. As we stood there, I felt like we were being watched. It was probably just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was observing us from the dense woods. We didn't stay long. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd seen. I've lived in East Texas my whole life and never believed the Bigfoot stories. People talk, you know, especially around here. The Big Thicket area has a long history of strange sightings. We're surrounded by national forests and parks, the Angelina, the Sabine, the Big Thicket Preserve. It's hundreds of thousands of acres of wilderness. You could hide an army in those woods. But I always thought Bigfoot was just a legend, something for tourists and TV shows. Now I don't know what to think. The hardest part was the weeks after. I had to drive that road every day to get to work. I started leaving later, when the sun was fully up. I'd white-knuckle the steering wheel the entire way, scanning the tree line continuously. Sometimes I'd take a longer route just to avoid that specific stretch of County Road 32. At home, things changed too. We have chickens, goats, and a couple of horses that I used to tend to in the early morning before work. After the encounter, I wouldn't go out to the barn before sunrise. My husband had to take over the morning feedings. Even now, 8 years later, I still get nervous being outside alone in the dark. I keep thinking about how close I came to... What? I don't know what would have happened if I'd gotten out of my car, and I don't want to know. A few months after my encounter, a TV show called Finding Bigfoot came to the area. They were filming an episode about sightings around East Texas. I didn't contact them. I wasn't ready to tell my story publicly, but I watched the episode when it aired. They interviewed several local people who claimed to have had encounters. Some of the stories sounded similar to mine. I've done research since then. Turns out the Jasper area has had dozens of reported sightings over the years. The geography makes sense. We have water sources, dense forest cover, minimal human interference, and plenty of wildlife. It's the perfect habitat for something that doesn't want to be found. I've told only a handful of people about what happened. Some believed me, some clearly didn't. My sister suggested I might have seen a bear standing on its hind legs. But I've seen bears. This wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. Longer legs, shorter torso, and the way it moved was nothing like a bear. Bears don't step over logs like humans do. They climb or go around. Someone else suggested it might have been a person in a ghillie suit, like hunters sometimes wear. But why would someone in a ghillie suit be on a county road at 5:40 in the morning? And how could they be that tall and move that quickly into dense forest? It doesn't make sense. The thing that sticks with me most is the knee. When it lifted its leg to step over that log, I saw the knee bend. It was such a human movement, but on a frame that was decidedly not human. Sometimes I dream about that knee lifting, that deliberate step. I wake up in a cold sweat. Last year, my husband and I were having dinner with friends, and somehow the conversation turned to unexplained experiences. After a few drinks, I shared my story. One of our friends, a guy who works for the Forestry Service, got very quiet. When the others had moved on to a different topic, he leaned over and told me he'd seen something similar while doing a survey about 30 miles from our spot. He'd never told anyone at work because he was afraid they'd think he was crazy or unfit for his job. I don't know what's out there in the East Texas woods. I don't know if what I saw was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or something else entirely. All I know is what I saw that March morning was real. It was alive. It was intelligent. And it's still out there. Even now, when I drive that stretch of road, I can't help but scan the trees. Sometimes I imagine catching a glimpse of something large moving between the pines, just a shadow shifting in the forest. I wonder if it remembers me the way I remember it. I wonder if it tells its own kind about the time it encountered a human in a strange metal box on the road. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the way it looked at me. That moment of mutual recognition, of two different worlds briefly colliding on a lonely East Texas road before dawn. Story 7. I'm still shaking as I type this. Even though it's been over a year, what happened that night in November '96 is burned into my memory like nothing else I've ever experienced. I've tried telling a few people, but the looks I get, well, you can imagine. That's why I'm finally putting this down here, where people might actually believe me. I was living on this small rural property near Wilderville, Oregon at the time. Beautiful place, really. Surrounded by forest, few neighbors scattered around, quiet. Too quiet sometimes. I'd moved there after finishing my teaching certification, looking for some peace while applying for English teaching positions. Having some military police experience in my background, I wasn't usually one to get spooked easily. That night, I was at the kitchen table working on a research paper for a graduate course I was taking. Must have been around 9:30 p.m., just me in the house. My roommate was away visiting family for the weekend. I had my little heeler dog, Max, tethered outside on his run. Good dog, smart as a whip, not one to bark without reason. I remember it was unusually cold for November, the kind of crisp, clear night where sound travels forever. I had the kitchen window cracked despite the chill. I liked the fresh air while working. My coffee had gone cold next to my laptop, and I was deep into writing when Max started barking. Not just barking, going absolutely ballistic. I'd never heard him like that before. It wasn't his "someone's coming up the driveway" bark or his "I see a raccoon" bark. This was frantic, almost desperate. I looked at the clock. 10:17 p.m. At first I tried to ignore it, but within minutes I realized something else was happening. The neighbors' dogs started up too. All of them, from properties all around, just losing their minds, barking and howling. Then I heard the horses, not just mine in the lower pasture, but the Hendersons' horses a quarter-mile away, all whinnying and making a ruckus. I got up and looked out the window but couldn't see much. Just Max straining at his tether, barking his head off toward the lower horse pasture. My two horses had moved up to the far corner of the upper pasture, which was weird because they usually stayed down in the lower field at night where the grass was better. Something felt wrong, really wrong. The air seemed different somehow, heavier. I'm not ashamed to admit that my first thought was to grab my gun. Call it military training or just country common sense. But when every animal within earshot is freaking out simultaneously, something's up. I got my Glock from the lockbox, grabbed the heavy maglite from the drawer, and slipped on my boots by the back door. "Easy, Max," I called out as I stepped onto the back porch. He didn't even acknowledge me, just kept staring and barking at something down by the lower pasture fence line, near where the telephone pole stands, outside the hot wire. His whole body was rigid, tail straight out behind him. I clicked on the flashlight, sweeping it across the property. The beam caught the reflective eyes of my horses up in the top pasture. They were standing close together, facing the same direction as Max, ears pricked forward. They weren't running around panicked, just alert, watchful. I moved down the steps and across the gravel toward Max, keeping the light moving. "What is it, boy?" I whispered when I reached him. He'd stopped barking now and was making this low, continuous growl deep in his throat. I'd never heard him make that sound before. His hackles were up so high he looked twice his size. Following his gaze, I swept the flashlight beam along the bottom pasture fence line. Nothing at first, just fence posts, the hot wire gleaming dully in the light. Then I noticed something odd by the telephone pole outside the fence, something that looked like a dark hump in the tall grass. I steadied the beam there. The hump moved. My blood went cold. Whatever it was big, really big, and it was crouched down, like it was trying to stay hidden in the grass that grew tall around the base of the pole. I tightened my grip on the gun, keeping it pointed at the ground, flashlight steady on that spot. "Hey!" I called out, thinking, hoping it might be a person. "This is private property." No response, but the shape shifted again. That's when Max I don't even know how to describe it. He screamed, not barked, not growled. He let out this high-pitched scream I didn't know dogs could make. Then he leaped straight up in the air like he'd been shocked, every hair on his body standing on end. When he landed, he bolted under my pickup truck parked nearby and just cowered there, whimpering. And that's when it stood up. Jesus Christ, it stood up. The thing by the telephone pole rose up on two legs. In the flashlight beam, I could see it was massive, easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall, broad shoulders, covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Arms too long, torso too wide. I froze, completely froze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its profile against the night sky. Not a bear, definitely not a bear. The head sat directly on those massive shoulders, no real neck to speak of. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakably humanoid. Then it moved. It started walking along the hot wire fence, walking upright, on two legs. Something in me snapped back to reality. I raised the pistol, keeping the flashlight beam fixed on the thing. My hands were shaking so bad, I don't know if I could have hit anything if I'd tried. But the movement, the posture, it's the one thing I remember with absolute clarity. It walked with purpose, not shambling or awkward like a bear trying to stand. This was a natural gait, and when it realized I was tracking it with the light, it took off running. God, the running, that's what haunts me most. It broke into a full bipedal run, moving with this powerful fluid stride that no human could match. There was this rhythmic thud, thud, thud as its feet hit the ground, heavy impacts I could feel through the soil. The cadence was wrong for a four-legged animal. This was 2 legs, 2 feet, moving with incredible speed along the fence line toward the tree line. My flashlight beam bounced along with it until it hit the trees at the edge of the property and vanished into the darkness. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I fucking ran. Back to the house, nearly tripping over my own feet. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and moved away from the windows. I was hyperventilating, my whole body shaking. I called the only person I could think of, my friend Dale's father, Bill, who lived about 20 minutes away. Bill had been a forest ranger for 30 years before retiring. If anyone would know what to do, it was him. "Bill," I said when he answered, my voice cracking. "There's something on my property, something big." I tried to explain what I'd seen, stumbling over my words. To his credit, Bill didn't laugh or dismiss me. He just said, "Stay inside, I'm coming over. Got my rifle in the truck already." Those 20 minutes waiting for Bill were the longest of my life. I got my shotgun from the safe, loaded it, and sat with my back against the kitchen wall, facing the back door. Outside, the dogs throughout the valley were still going nuts. My horses had moved even further up the pasture, as far from the fence line as they could get. And poor Max wouldn't come out from under the truck, not even when I called him. When Bill's headlights finally swept up the driveway, I nearly cried with relief. He came prepared, rifle, spotlight, even brought his own dog, a German shepherd named Rex. The big dog was agitated from the moment they arrived, whining and pulling at his leash. "Show me where," Bill said after I'd given him the condensed version. No questions, no skepticism, just practical action. We went out together, both armed, Bill handling the spotlight while Rex strained at his leash. The neighbor dogs were still barking, though not as frantically as before. My horses hadn't moved from their corner. Max finally crawled out when he saw Rex, but stayed plastered to my leg, trembling. Bill methodically swept the property with his spotlight, working from the house toward where I'd seen the figure. When we reached the spot by the telephone pole, he knelt down, examining the grass. "Something was here," he said quietly, pointing to a flattened area in the tall grass. "Something big." We followed the path I'd seen the figure take, finding disturbed vegetation along the way, tall grass bent and broken in a clear trail leading to the trees. But when we hit the gravel road that ran along the edge of my property before the tree line, the trail vanished. No footprints on the hard-packed gravel, nothing. Bill stood there for a long time, scanning the trees with his spotlight. Rex was anxious, whining and pulling toward the woods, then backing away like he couldn't decide what to do. "What do you think it was?" I finally asked. Bill was quiet for a moment. "Don't know for sure," he said eventually. "But I've seen signs like this before up in the national forest. Areas where nothing makes sense. Big things moving through without leaving the prints they should." He didn't say the word, didn't have to. We spent another hour searching before giving up. Bill offered to stay the night, but I said I'd be okay. Stupid pride. Truth is, I didn't sleep a wink. Sat up all night with the shotgun across my lap, jumping at every sound. Max finally came inside, but wouldn't leave my side, and he kept staring at the windows, growling softly. The weird thing is, the animal activity didn't settle down until well after sunrise. Dogs, all through the little community, kept barking and howling all night. Horses stayed huddled together in their pastures. It was like whatever had been there had left some kind of presence behind that they could still sense. Max took a full day to return to normal. My tough little cattle dog who'd chase off coyotes without hesitation was jumpy and clingy for 24 solid hours. The horses wouldn't go back down to the lower pasture for 3 days. I've gone over that night 1,000 times in my head. Tried to convince myself it was a bear, a transient person, anything else. But I know what I saw, the way it moved, the deliberate bipedal gait, the incredible speed when it ran, the proportions all wrong for a human, but not right for any known animal either. I still live in the area, still teach English at the high school in Grants Pass. But I moved closer to town a couple months after it happened. Told people it was to shorten my commute, but the truth is I couldn't stand being out there alone anymore. I've never seen it again, never want to. But sometimes when I'm driving back from late meetings at school, passing through those dark stretches of road near Wilderville, I catch myself scanning the tree line, and I never ever stop. Story 8. I've been hesitant to share this experience for years, but after watching yet another documentary that brought everything back, I need to get this off my chest. I'm not the type to believe in the supernatural or cryptids. I'm pretty grounded in reality. But what happened to me and my girlfriend Katie at Lake Salmac back in summer 2008 still makes me question everything I thought I knew about the woods of Oregon. Katie and I had been dating for about a year and were both huge outdoors people. We'd gone camping plenty of times before, usually at popular spots with other campers around, but this time we wanted something more secluded, somewhere we could really disconnect from everything and everyone. After some research, we found this small campground at Lake Salmac in Oregon that had exactly 1 yurt for rent. Perfect, we thought. When we arrived that Friday afternoon in July, the first thing that struck me was how empty the place was. I mean, completely deserted. The ranger station looked like it hadn't been manned in days. We had to use the self-registration, leaving our money in the little envelope. I remember joking to Katie about how we could have probably stayed for free since nobody seemed to be checking anyway. Our yurt was located right near the entrance of the park, across from this decent-sized pond. It was a beautiful spot. Tall pines surrounding us, the water reflecting the sunlight. The yurt itself was basic but comfortable enough. Wooden platform, canvas walls, those simple cot-style beds. We unloaded our stuff, set up our little cooking area outside, and spent the afternoon hiking some of the nearby trails. Everything was completely normal that first day. We saw some deer, birds, the usual wildlife you'd expect. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with a slight breeze. We kept commenting on how lucky we were to have the entire place to ourselves. In hindsight, I should have wondered why nobody else was there in the middle of camping season. As evening approached, we built a fire in the designated pit outside our yurt and cooked some hot dogs and beans. Classic camping fare. We sat around drinking beers, talking about random stuff, making plans for the next day. The sun had set completely by around 9:30, and the only light came from our fire and the nearly full moon overhead. That's when things started to feel off. It began with this sense that we were being watched. I know how that sounds, like the beginning of every horror movie ever, but it wasn't dramatic. It was this subtle, nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Katie felt it too, though neither of us said anything at first. We just kept glancing toward the tree line beyond our campsite. Then we started hearing these crackling noises from the underbrush about 50 yards away. At first, I assumed it was a deer or maybe an elk, They're common in that area, but the pattern of movement seemed deliberate, almost calculated. Whatever it was would move a bit, stop, then move again. It sounded heavy, much heavier than a deer, breaking twigs and rustling leaves as it went. "Do you hear that?" Katie finally whispered, her eyes wide in the firelight. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Probably just an elk or something." But the way this thing was moving didn't feel like normal animal behavior. It seemed to be circling our campsite, always staying just beyond where our firelight reached. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sounds a few times, but never saw anything, just the wall of dark forest beyond. We stayed up later than planned, both of us reluctant to go to sleep while those sounds continued. We kept the fire going strong, adding more wood whenever it started to die down. The crackling noises persisted for at least 2 hours, always moving, always staying hidden. Finally, around midnight, the sounds stopped. We waited another half hour or so, and when nothing happened, we decided to turn in. Inside the yurt, we zipped everything up tight and laid down. I remember having trouble falling asleep, straining to hear any sounds outside. Katie fell asleep almost immediately. She could always do that no matter what, but I tossed and turned for a while before drifting off. I woke up around 8 a.m. the next morning, earlier than I'd planned. Katie was still sound asleep. I needed to use the bathroom, so I quietly unzipped the yurt door and stepped outside. The moment I was outside, I was hit with the most overwhelming, putrid stench I've ever encountered in my life. It wasn't just bad, it was physically repulsive, like rotted garbage that had been sitting in the sun for weeks, mixed with something musky and animal-like. The smell was so intense it made my eyes water and my stomach turn. My first instinct was to cover my nose and mouth with my shirt. I looked around, thinking maybe a bear had gotten into someone's trash or an animal had died nearby. But there was nothing obvious causing the smell. The campground looked exactly as we'd left it the night before. Our cooler was untouched. Nothing was disturbed. The smell seemed to be coming from the direction where we'd heard the noises the night before. My first thought was that it might be an elk marking its territory or something. I'd encountered some pretty rank animal odors before while hiking, but nothing like this. This was different, more concentrated and far more foul. I quickly used the campground toilet about 50 yards from our yurt, then hurried back. The smell followed me everywhere, seemingly permeating the entire area around our campsite. I decided not to wake Katie yet. I wanted to start making breakfast first, and maybe the smell would dissipate. I got the camp stove going and started heating water for coffee, trying to breathe through my mouth the whole time. After about 30 minutes, Katie emerged from the yurt, rubbing her eyes. "Morning," she said sleepily, then immediately scrunched up her face. "Oh my God, what is that smell?" I was almost relieved that she noticed it too. I don't know. It was here when I woke up. Maybe something died nearby. She covered her nose with her hand. "It's horrible, like something rotting." We were discussing whether we should move to a different part of the campground for breakfast when it happened. From the same direction as last night's crackling noises, maybe 100 yards into the forest, came the most chilling sound I've ever heard in my life. It started as a low growl that quickly built into something I can only describe as a roar howl. Primal, powerful, and utterly unlike anything I've ever heard from any known animal. It wasn't a wolf or coyote howl. It wasn't a bear's roar. It was deeper, longer, more structured, almost like it contained syllables. The sound echoed through the trees, seeming to come from something with massive lungs and vocal capacity. It was so loud that we both physically jumped, and birds scattered from several trees nearby. Katie's face went completely white. "What the hell is that?" And she gasped, grabbing my arm so hard her nails dug in. I couldn't answer because I had no idea. The vocalization lasted maybe 10 to 15 seconds total, ending with a series of quick, guttural barks that diminished in volume. Then silence fell again, heavier than before. We both stood frozen, staring toward the source of the sound. I remember noticing that all other forest sounds had stopped. No birds, no insects, nothing, just complete silence. "We need to leave," Katie whispered, not taking her eyes off the tree line. Part of me wanted to investigate, to see what had made that sound, but the more rational part knew that was a terrible idea. Whatever had made that noise was big and potentially dangerous. "Yeah," I agreed. "Let's pack up." We moved quickly, throwing our things together with minimal talking. The smell was still heavy in the air, making it hard to breathe normally. Every few minutes we'd stop and listen, but the forest remained unnervingly quiet. As we were loading our car, we heard distant crackling again. The same sound as last night, but further away. Something large moving through the underbrush. We worked faster. Just as I was securing the last of our gear in the trunk, Katie froze beside me, staring toward the pond across from our campsite. "Don," she whispered, "look." On the far side of the pond, partially obscured by trees, was a large, dark shape. Even from that distance, maybe 200 yards away, I could tell it was tall, much taller than a person. It was standing upright between two large pines, perfectly still, watching us. The morning mist hovering over the pond made it difficult to see clearly, but what I could make out didn't look like any animal I recognized. It seemed to have a bulky upper body and a somewhat conical head that sat directly on its shoulders with little visible neck. We stared at it for maybe 5 seconds before it moved, stepping backward into denser forest cover and disappearing from view. The movement was smooth, deliberate, not an animal on 4 legs, but something walking upright. "That wasn't a bear," Katie said, her voice shaking. "No," I agreed, "it wasn't." We got in the car and I started the engine. As we drove toward the campground exit, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees behind us. Nothing did, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched until we were miles away on the main highway. For the first 20 minutes of the drive, neither of us spoke. Finally, Katie broke the silence. "That sound," she said. "Do you think it was a Bigfoot?" Under normal circumstances, I would have laughed at the suggestion. I'd always considered Bigfoot stories to be campfire tales and hoaxes, but after what we'd just experienced, the deliberate movement around our camp, the overpowering smell that matched descriptions I'd later research, and especially that vocalization, I couldn't dismiss it so easily. "I don't know," I answered honestly. When we got home, I immediately went online and searched for animal sounds. I listened to recordings of every large predator in Oregon, bears, cougars, everything. None matched what we'd heard. Then, reluctantly, I searched for Sasquatch vocalizations and found some supposed recordings from various documentaries. The similarities to what we'd heard were undeniable. I also learned that many Bigfoot encounters include reports of an intense, garbage-like odor that appears and disappears suddenly. Exactly what we'd experienced. I've never gone back to Lake Salmac. Katie and I broke up about 6 months later for unrelated reasons, but we occasionally text when another Bigfoot documentary comes out. "Was it like that?" one of us will ask. The answer is always yes. I still don't know for certain what happened that summer morning in 2008. I'm not claiming we saw a Sasquatch. What I am certain of is that we encountered something in those woods that I cannot explain. Something that made a sound no known animal makes, that left a smell unlike anything I've experienced before or since, and that watched us from the tree line before disappearing into the forest. Whatever it was, it seemed intelligent enough to observe us without fully revealing itself. That's the part that still unsettles me most when I think about it. Not just that something unknown was out there, but that it was watching us, deliberately, with what felt like purpose. I've returned to camping many times since then, but never alone, and never in such isolated spots. And I always find myself scanning the tree line at dusk, listening for crackling in the underbrush. Story 9. I've spent over 30 years hunting in the Pacific Northwest, I've seen bears, cougars, and just about every other animal you'd expect to find in the forests of Oregon. But what I encountered on that October morning in 2010 near Hugo wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. I'm still trying to make sense of it 13 years later. It was October 8th, just after the start of deer season. I'd taken the day off work to get an early start, hoping to bag a buck before the weekend crowd showed up. I'd been hunting this same area for years. It's about 20 miles west of Grants Pass, deep in the forests near Hugo. The spot had always been good to me. I got to my usual parking area around 6:30 a.m. It was one of those typical Pacific Northwest fall mornings, overcast, damp and chilly, probably in the low 40s. I remember checking the weather forecast the night before because I was worried about rain. After gearing up and grabbing my rifle, I started walking along this ATV trail I knew well. It wasn't much more than a dirt path that wound through the trees and up into some promising hunting grounds. The woods were still dark. I had my flashlight with me but kept it off. Any experienced hunter knows you don't want to announce your presence when you're trying to spot deer. I was moving really slowly and carefully, placing each step to avoid making noise. The ground was damp from overnight condensation, which helped keep things quiet. There was just enough light to see the trail ahead of me, but the woods on either side were still pretty dark. I'd gone about half a mile from my truck when it happened. I remember checking my watch just before. It was 7:15 a.m. The sun was starting to rise, but under the thick tree cover and with the overcast sky, visibility was still poor. I was walking around a slight bend in the trail when I saw movement ahead of me. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer crossing, which is exactly what I was hoping for. But immediately, something felt wrong. The shape was all wrong, too big, and the movement was different. About 10 yards ahead of me, this thing has crossed the trail from left to right. It covered the entire width of the trail, which had to be 15-20 feet in just 2 strides. 2 strides. And the weirdest part, it made almost no noise, just a very slight rustling of underbrush. None of the crashing or breaking branches you'd expect from something that size moving through the forest. I froze instantly. Every instinct in my body was screaming danger. My hand fumbled for my flashlight, and I switched it on, pointing it in the direction of whatever had just crossed the path. And that's when I saw it. The beam caught the back half of what I can only describe as a massive, muscular, dark, fur-covered creature. It stood upright on 2 legs, walking like a man, but not a man, not even close. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably closer to 7.5. I've hunted all my life, and I'm pretty good at estimating the size and weight of animals. This thing had to weigh at least 500 pounds, maybe more. The fur was dark brown, almost black and thick, not like a bear's fur, which tends to look shaggy. This was more uniform, covering the entire body. The shoulders were impossibly broad and muscular, tapering down to a narrower waist. The arms were long, hanging down past where a human's would end, and the legs. The stride length alone told me these weren't human legs. I've seen plenty of black bears in these woods over the years. I know what a bear looks like when it's standing on its hind legs. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright with that kind of fluid motion. They don't have that proportioned, almost human-like silhouette. And they absolutely don't move that silently or that fast. The creature never turned toward me or acknowledged my presence in any way. It just continued down the hill to my right, quickly disappearing into the trees. The whole encounter lasted maybe 3 to 5 seconds at most, but those few seconds completely changed how I view the woods I've spent my entire life in. I stood there frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mouth had gone completely dry. I became hyper-aware of how alone I was out there, half a mile from my truck, several miles from the nearest paved road, and with absolutely no cell service. What really got to me was how vulnerable I felt. I had my rifle, sure, but in that moment it felt completely inadequate. Whatever that thing was, it was massive, powerful, and fast. If it had wanted to harm me, I don't think I would have had much chance. The fear I felt was different from anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't just the surprise of seeing something unexpected. It was deeper than that, almost primal, like my body recognized a predator that my mind couldn't fully process. After standing there for what felt like forever, I started backing up slowly, keeping my flashlight pointed in the direction where the creature had disappeared. I didn't turn my back until I was a good 50 yards back down the trail. Then I just turned and walked as fast as I could without running back to my truck. I remember getting back to the truck, and my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice trying to unlock the door. Once inside, I locked all the doors immediately and just sat there, trying to process what I'd seen. I didn't start the engine right away because I was genuinely worried the noise might attract whatever it was back in my direction. After about 10 minutes of sitting there, my heart rate finally slowed enough that I felt safe to drive. I got out of there as quickly as I could without going off the dirt road. The whole drive home, I kept trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear after all, and the poor light conditions made it look different. But I've seen hundreds of bears over my years of hunting. This wasn't a bear. Maybe it was some guy in a costume. But who would be out in the remote woods at dawn, wearing a costume, moving with that kind of speed and agility? And why? It made no sense. When I got home, my wife immediately knew something was wrong. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. When I told her what happened, I could see she was concerned but skeptical. I don't blame her. If someone had told me the same story a day earlier, I would have thought they were exaggerating or confused too. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'd wake up in the middle of the night remembering the silhouette of that thing moving through the trees. I found myself researching similar encounters online, which I never expected to do. I've always been a practical, no-nonsense kind of guy. I never put much stock in Bigfoot stories or anything like that. But after what I saw, I couldn't dismiss them anymore. What really bothers me is that I didn't get a clear look at its face. It never turned toward me, so I can't describe any facial features. But maybe that's a blessing. I'm not sure I want to know what it looked like up close. I've only told a few people about what happened. Most react with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. A couple of hunting buddies have shared their own strange experiences after hearing mine, though nothing as clear or close as what I saw. I didn't go back to that specific spot for almost 2 years. When I finally did return, I brought my brother-in-law with me. I didn't tell him exactly why I wanted company, just that I preferred not to hunt alone there anymore. We didn't see anything unusual that day, or any day since, but I hunt differently now. I'm more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I rarely go out alone anymore, especially in the early morning or evening hours, and I always carry a more powerful flashlight. What's strange is that despite how terrifying the encounter was, the creature never made any aggressive moves toward me. It didn't seem interested in me at all. It was just passing through, almost like I was the intruder in its territory, not the other way around. I still don't know what to call what I saw that day. Bigfoot seems too simple, too cartoonish for the powerful, silent creature I encountered. Whatever it was perfectly adapted to those woods in a way that made me, an experienced hunter with decades in those forests, feel like an amateur. Sometimes when I'm out in the woods now, especially when visibility is poor, I get this feeling of being watched. It's probably just my imagination working overtime since that encounter. But maybe not. Maybe there's more to our forests than we're willing to admit. I don't expect people to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't a bear, a moose, an elk, or any other animal I've encountered in over 3 decades of hunting. It was something else entirely. The strangest part? Even though it was the most frightening experience of my life, there's a part of me that wishes I could see it again, just from a safer distance, and maybe with a camera. Because until you've seen something like that with your own eyes, it's impossible to understand how it changes your perspective on everything you thought you knew about the natural world. That day in October 2010 lasted only a few hours, but it stayed with me every day since. Sometimes I wonder if there's a whole world of creatures out there that we've somehow missed, or that have gotten very good at avoiding us. And sometimes, especially when I'm alone in the woods at dawn, I wonder if they're watching me right now. Story 10. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that October night in 2004. I've gone back and forth about sharing this for years, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone out there has experienced something similar and can help me make sense of it. My friends Mark and Diane had asked me to house-sit their place while they went on a 2-week vacation to Hawaii. Their property is pretty remote, nestled at the end of this long gravel driveway off Oregon Caves Road in Caves Junction. It's beautiful country, but isolated, dense forest on 3 sides and a river running along the back of the property. The nearest neighbor is about half a mile away. I'd been to their place several times before, so I was familiar with it. They have this cute little 2-bedroom cabin, a detached garage, and a small barn where they kept some chickens and garden supplies. The place is gorgeous, but definitely off the beaten path. I arrived late afternoon on October 15th. The autumn weather was cool but pleasant, typical Oregon fall. After Mark and Diane showed me around and gave me the rundown on feeding the chickens and other chores, they headed out for their flight. I remember joking about not having any wild parties as they drove away. The first evening was uneventful. I made dinner, watched some TV, and went to bed around 11. I slept well, and everything felt normal. The next morning, I got up around 7:30, made coffee, and headed out to feed the chickens. That's when things started getting weird. As I approached the barn, I noticed the door was wide open. I distinctly remembered closing and latching it the night before. Mark had been very specific about making sure the door was secured to keep predators out. I figured maybe I hadn't latched it properly and the wind had blown it open overnight. But when I walked into the barn, my heart sank. There were chicken feathers everywhere, scattered across the floor in a bloody mess. And all 8 chickens were gone. Not just dead, completely gone. I searched around thinking maybe a fox or coyote had gotten in, but there was no sign of the chickens other than the feathers and some blood. That's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I've dealt with predators before, growing up in rural areas, foxes, coyotes, even the occasional bear. They don't typically take every single chicken, and they certainly don't unlatch barn doors. They dig under or find small openings. I walked back outside, trying to figure out what could have happened. That's when I noticed the footprints in the soft soil outside the barn door. They weren't animal tracks. They looked human, but wrong, too big, way too big. They were clearly 5-toed like a human foot, but measured around 16 inches long. I put my boot next to one for comparison. I wear a size 11. And these prints were nearly twice as long. I followed the tracks with my eyes, seeing they led from the barn toward the river through a section of timber and blackberry vines. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. I kept telling myself it must be some kind of prank, or there was a logical explanation, but deep down I was already freaking out. The tracks were easy to follow through the damp morning soil. They headed straight through the timber toward the river, pushing through blackberry thickets that would have torn my clothes to shreds. Whatever made these tracks didn't seem bothered by the thorns. About 50 yards into the woods, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. There was a stack of rocks, carefully piled about 4 feet high. It wasn't random. The rocks were deliberately placed, largest at the bottom, smallest at the top. And scattered around this rock stack were more chicken feathers, fresh ones. I stood there staring at this rock formation, trying to make sense of it. Who would build something like this in the middle of the woods? And why were there chicken feathers around it? It felt ritualistic somehow, and that thought sent a chill down my spine. I continued following the tracks a bit further, and they led straight to the river before disappearing. I scanned the opposite bank, but didn't see any signs of crossing. With an uneasy feeling growing in my stomach, I headed back to the house. I spent the rest of the day feeling on edge. I secured the barn with the padlock Mark had given me for emergencies and tried to busy myself around the house. I chopped extra firewood, brought in more than I needed, and kept checking the windows every few minutes. As the day wore on, I became increasingly paranoid about the lack of curtains in the house. Most of the windows were just bare glass, fine for enjoying the forest view during the day, but at night they'd turn into black mirrors that anyone or anything could look through from the darkness. As evening approached, I made sure all the doors were locked. I even dragged a chair in front of the back door as an extra measure. I tried watching TV to distract myself, but I couldn't focus. Every sound from outside, branches moving in the wind, distant animal calls, made me jump. Around 9 p.m., I decided to distract myself by working on my laptop. Mark and Diane had a small office-guest room in the back of the house with a desk facing the window that looked out toward the river and forest. I figured I'd check my emails and maybe browse the internet to take my mind off things. I shut off most of the lights in the house, thinking it would be better if I wasn't silhouetted against the windows. The moon was nearly full that night, casting an eerie silver glow across the property. I could see the edge of the forest and the beginning of the yard clearly in the moonlight. I'd been sitting at the computer for maybe 20 minutes when I felt a change in the air. It's hard to explain, like a pressure shift or the feeling you get when someone enters a room behind you. I looked up from the screen, and that's when it happened. A massive shadow passed directly in front of the window. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then it stopped, and I found myself staring into the face of something. It was peering into the window, its head level with the glass, and this was a window that had to be at least 7 feet off the ground. Even in the moonlight, I could make out enough details to know this wasn't human. The face was covered in dark hair with deep-set eyes that reflected the moonlight. They were looking directly at me, intelligent, curious, and unmistakably aware. It had a broad, flat nose and a heavy brow ridge. The shoulders below its head were massive, easily twice the width of a large man. I froze completely. I didn't scream, I didn't move. Some primal instinct told me to stay absolutely still. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. I could see its breath fogging the window slightly. Then it moved away from the window, and I heard heavy footsteps on the wooden deck outside. The whole house seemed to vibrate slightly with each step. Through the window I could see it now, the full figure in the moonlight. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with long arms that hung lower than a human's would. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. The creature walked slowly across the deck, stopping occasionally to look around or touch things. The stack of firewood, a garden tool Mark had left out. Its movements were deliberate, almost curious, not aggressive or threatening, which somehow made the whole thing even more terrifying. I remained frozen at the desk, barely breathing. The creature lingered on the deck for about 10 minutes, occasionally glancing toward the windows of the house. Finally, it stepped off the deck and moved with surprising quietness back to the edge of the forest near the river. Before disappearing into the trees, it stopped and looked back at the house one last time. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I moved to the living room, away from the windows, and sat with my back against the wall until morning, jumping at every sound. I considered calling the police, but kept asking myself what I would say. "Hello, officer. I think Bigfoot ate my friend's chickens and then came to peek in the windows." They'd think I was crazy or drunk. When dawn finally broke, I immediately went outside to check for evidence. The dew was heavy on the grass, and there they were, the same huge footprints, now clearly visible on the deck and leading across the yard to the forest edge. I followed them to the tree line, noting how deep they pressed into the relatively dry ground, at least 1.5 inches deep. Whatever made these tracks was incredibly heavy. I took measurements and even some photos with my digital camera, though the quality isn't great. 16 inches long, about 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot. 5 toes, just like a human foot, but massive. The stride length was huge too, nearly 4 feet between steps. A normal human would have to jump to make steps that far apart. I packed up and left that afternoon. I called Mark and Diane from the road with some made-up family emergency. I've never told them what really happened. I've barely told anyone until now. To this day, I don't know exactly what I saw. I've researched countless Bigfoot sightings since then, and many of the descriptions match what I encountered. The height, the appearance, even the curious behavior rather than aggression. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after finding the chicken mess. But then I remember those eyes looking directly into mine, the intelligence behind them, and the footprints the next morning. Whatever I saw that night in Caves Junction was real, and it was no human. Story 11. I still don't know what to make of what happened last year. I'm not someone who believes in monsters or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. I'm an environmental engineer. I deal with facts, measurements, and practical solutions. But what I experienced in Wisconsin has been eating at me, and I need to get it off my chest. In 2010, my company sent me to assess land for a potential wind farm project near Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. The location was a mix of private farmland bordering a wildlife sanctuary with forests, rolling hills, and a sizable swamp area with some limestone caves. Pretty standard stuff for that region. I'd done dozens of similar assessments before. My assistant Dave and I arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October. Perfect weather for fieldwork. Crisp but not cold. Clear skies. We had our equipment. GPS units, soil testing kits, cameras, the usual gear. The plan was to spend 3 days mapping the area, checking soil stability, measuring wind patterns, and noting any environmental concerns. The first day was completely normal. We mapped the farmland areas, which were mostly abandoned fields that hadn't been cultivated in years. The second day, we headed toward the forested hills to continue our survey. That's when things got weird. Dave and I had split up to cover more ground. I was taking soil samples near where the forest met the swamp edge when I realized something felt off. It took me a minute to figure out what was bothering me. There was no sound, none. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves, even though there was a slight breeze, just dead silence. I've been in plenty of quiet places in nature, but this was different. It felt unnatural, like someone had hit a mute button on the whole area. The hairs on my arms stood up. I called out for Dave, and my voice sounded wrong somehow, flat and muffled, like it didn't carry. I decided to walk toward where Dave should be. As I moved deeper into the swampy area, I noticed the trees started to look strange. At first, I thought maybe it was beaver damage or some kind of fungal disease. But as I got closer, I realized the trees were bent, not broken, but deliberately bent and twisted together. Now, I've seen beaver dams, storm damage, and all kinds of natural phenomena. This wasn't any of that. These were living trees, some as thick as my thigh, bent over in arcs and woven together to form what looked like a crude shelter. The bark wasn't damaged in ways consistent with natural bending. It was as if they'd been gradually manipulated over time to grow that way. I stood there staring at this structure, trying to make sense of it. It was about 8 feet tall at its highest point, with an opening facing away from the wind. Inside, the ground was clear of debris. No leaves, no twigs, nothing. just bare, packed earth that looked like something had been lying there. I took out my camera and snapped several photos. My mind was racing through explanations. Maybe some kind of local art project, a hunter's blind, but it was too elaborate, too precisely constructed for either of those explanations. I didn't realize Dave had walked up behind me until he spoke, which nearly gave me a heart attack. "What the fuck is that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I jumped and turned around. "Jesus, Dave, don't sneak up on me like that." Dave wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the structure, his face pale. "We need to go," he said. "Hold on," I said. "This is weird. I need to document it for the report." I started taking measurements and notes. Dave kept looking around nervously. "Otis, seriously, let's go. This place feels wrong." I was about to argue when we both heard it. A deep, guttural sound from somewhere in the swamp. Not quite a growl, not quite a moan. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Dave didn't wait for me to finish. He turned and started walking quickly back toward our truck. I took a few more photos, grabbed my gear, and followed him. The whole time, I felt like someone, or something, was watching us. When we got back to the truck, Dave was already inside with the doors locked. His hands were shaking as he tried to put the key in the ignition. "Calm down," I said. "It was probably just a bear or something." "That wasn't a bear," Dave muttered. "Bears don't build shelters out of living trees." I didn't have a response for that. We drove back to our motel in silence. Dave was clearly rattled, but I was more intrigued than scared at that point. I decided to ask around town, thinking maybe there was a logical explanation local people could provide. That evening we stopped at a small cafe in Fond du Lac. It was one of those places where everyone turns to look when strangers walk in. I struck up a conversation with the waitress and eventually mentioned what we'd found in the swamp. To my surprise, several of the locals at the counter started laughing. An older man with a John Deere cap turned to us. "You boys found one of them structures, huh?" he said. "Them things have been holding up that wind project for years now." I was confused. "What do you mean?" "Every time someone comes out to survey that land, they find something weird and the project gets delayed. Been happening since they first proposed it back in '05. The waitress nodded. "My cousin worked for the last company that tried. Said they kept finding those twisted trees and weird footprints. Eventually, they just gave up." I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos I'd taken. The laughter died down, and several people exchanged glances. An elderly man at the end of the counter, who hadn't spoken yet, got up and came over to look at my photos. He must have been in his 80s, with deeply wrinkled skin and clear blue eyes. "That's a fresh one," he said quietly. "Usually they're deeper in the swamp." "You know what made it?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Son, people have been disappearing in that swamp since before I was born. My daddy used to tell stories about it, said there was something living out there that didn't want to be found. I thought he was just trying to scare us with local folklore, but his expression was dead serious. Back in '78, I was hunting out that way and found tracks," the old man continued. "Big tracks, about 24 inches long. Followed them for half a mile before I lost them in the water. Whatever made those prints wasn't human, and wasn't any animal I know of." Dave was visibly uncomfortable now, but I was fascinated. "Have you seen these tree structures before?" The old man nodded. "Found my first one when I was just a boy. My grandpa told me to stay away from them, said they were shelters." "Shelters for what?" I asked. He just shook his head and went back to his seat. The next morning, Dave refused to go back to the swamp area. He said he'd work on processing the data we'd already collected while I finished the field assessment. I didn't push him. He was genuinely scared, and I didn't want to make things worse. I decided to visit some of the farms bordering the wildlife sanctuary to complete our land survey. At the third farm, I met a middle-aged couple who raised pigs. When I mentioned what we'd found in the swamp, the husband went quiet while the wife suddenly remembered she had chores to do inside. Once she was gone, the farmer looked around as if making sure no one else could hear us. "Listen," he said in a low voice. "Something's been taking my hogs for years. Not just mine. Happens to everyone around here with livestock." "What do you mean, taking?" I asked. "They just disappear. No blood, no sign of struggle. Just gone. At first I thought it was thieves, but who steals a 300-pound hog without leaving any evidence? And why take only one or two when they could clean me out?" I asked if he'd reported it to the police. He laughed bitterly. "Sure did the first few times. They suggested it was coyotes or wolves. Have you ever seen a coyote carry off a full-grown hog without leaving a trace? Besides, I've got fencing that keeps out predators." He led me to his barn, where several large pigs were penned up. The fencing was indeed substantial, with concrete footings and heavy gauge wire. About 5 years back, a bunch of us farmers got together after Billy Krause lost 3 prize hogs in one night. We decided to set a trap. "What kind of trap?" I asked. "We took one of my biggest hogs, staked it out near the edge of the swamp, and waited with rifles. 6 of us, all experienced hunters." He paused, lighting a cigarette with slightly trembling hands. "Just after midnight, this thing came out of the trees. It was dark. Couldn't see it clearly, but it was big. Way bigger than a man. Moved funny, too, kind of hunched over. When it went for the hog, we all opened fire. Must have hit it at least a dozen times." "You killed it?" I asked, feeling my mouth go dry. "Yeah. It made this sound when it fell. I still hear it sometimes in my dreams. Like nothing I've ever heard before or since." "What did you do with it?" "We were gonna call the authorities, but Jim Welker, he was our county supervisor back then, he was with us and said it would be better if we handled it ourselves. Said the government would just take over the whole area if word got out. So we took care of it." "What was it?" I pressed. He took a long drag from his cigarette. "Don't rightly know. Covered in reddish-brown hair. Huge feet. Face was not quite right. Not a bear, not a man, but something in between. We skinned it and buried the rest. Jim kept the hide." "Do you still have it? The hide?" My heart was racing now. "Jim died 3 years ago. His son might have it, but they don't talk about it. None of us do. It's just something that happened that we don't mention." I asked if I could talk to any of the others who were there that night. He refused to give me names, said they'd all agreed never to discuss it. Before I left, he grabbed my arm. "Listen, mister, if you're smart, you'll tell your company that swamp area isn't suitable for your windmills. There's plenty of other places to put them." I drove back to our motel in a daze. Part of me thought the farmer was just spinning tales, but he seemed genuinely afraid. And his story aligned with what the old man at the cafe had said. The next day, I received a call from our project manager saying that government officials had reviewed our preliminary findings and wanted us to reroute the access road to avoid the swamp area entirely. When I asked why, she just said it was environmental concerns and that the decision had been made at levels above her. I tried to include the tree structure in my final report, complete with photographs, but was told to remove that section. The official reason was that it wasn't relevant to the engineering assessment. The project was approved with the modified route, and construction began 6 months later. I've never told anyone else about what I saw or heard in Fond du Lac. Dave quit his job a month after we got back and moved to Arizona. We haven't spoken since. Sometimes I look at the photos I kept of that tree structure, trying to convince myself there's a rational explanation. But then I remember the unnatural silence in the swamp, the farmer's haunted expression, and the way the government so quickly redirected our project without explanation. I don't know what lives in that swamp. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods doing fieldwork, I find myself listening more carefully, looking over my shoulder more often. And if I ever hear that absolute silence again, I won't stick around to investigate. Story 12. I've never told this story publicly before. It's been almost 30 years now, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. What happened to me in 1994 on Etalon Island changed how I see the world forever. I was 32 at the time, an experienced hunter who'd been tracking game through the Alaskan wilderness since I was a teenager. My buddy Mike and I had planned this hunting trip for months. Etalon is remote, even by Alaskan standards, a heavily wooded island with dense forest and rough terrain. Perfect for hunting, or so we thought. We'd set up our base camp in a small clearing about 2 miles inland from where our boat was docked. The first couple days were uneventful. We bagged a few grouse, spotted some deer tracks, but nothing special. The weather was typical for October in Alaska, cold but manageable, with sporadic light snow. On the third morning, October 18th, 1994, a date burned into my memory. I woke up before dawn. Mike was still passed out in his sleeping bag, snoring away. I remember checking my watch, 4:47 a.m. Too early even for first light, but I was wide awake, feeling restless. I decided to scout around camp while Mike slept. I grabbed my rifle, a Remington 700 I'd had for years, threw on my heavy coat and boots, and slipped out of the tent. It was cold, probably around 25 degrees, and there had been a light dusting of snow overnight, just enough to cover the ground. The moon was bright enough that I didn't need my flashlight right away. I'd only gone about 50 yards from camp when I noticed them, footprints in the fresh snow. Big footprints. At first, I thought maybe a bear had passed through, but one look, and I knew better. These weren't bear tracks. They were clearly foot-shaped, human-like but massive, with 5 distinct toes. I'd been hunting all my life and had never seen anything like them. My heart started beating faster. I knelt down and placed my hand next to one of the prints. My hand looked tiny in comparison. The print was fresh, the edges still sharp in the snow, not rounded by melting or wind. Whatever made it had passed by recently, probably within the hour. I should have gone back to wake Mike. That would have been the smart move. Instead, I decided to follow the tracks. Looking back, I can't explain why. Curiosity, stupidity, maybe a bit of both. The tracks led uphill, away from our camp, into a thicker part of the forest. I followed them slowly, rifle ready, trying to move quietly. The snow helped muffle my footsteps, but every twig snap sounded like a gunshot in the pre-dawn silence. After about 15 minutes of tracking, I came to a small clearing. The sky was just starting to lighten, that deep blue before actual dawn. There was enough light now that I could see across the clearing to the trees on the other side, maybe 40 feet away. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. Against the tree line stood what I initially thought was a bear rearing up on its hind legs, but no. This was standing naturally upright. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was covered in dark hair, not fur like a bear, but longer, silkier hair that moved slightly in the breeze. I froze, completely froze. My finger instinctively moved toward the safety on my rifle, but I couldn't take my eyes off the creature. It was standing with one hand on its hip, almost in a casual pose, while its other arm reached up to grip a hemlock branch above its head. The casual humanness of the posture is what struck me most. It hadn't seen me yet. I was downwind, partially hidden by a cluster of small pines. For maybe 10 seconds, I just stood there watching it, my mind racing. This was no bear. This was no man in a suit. This was something else entirely. Then I shifted my weight, and a twig snapped under my boot. The creature's head turned toward me with startling speed. Our eyes met across the clearing, and that's when everything changed. It's hard to explain what happened next without sounding crazy. The creature, the Sasquatch, looked directly at me, and I felt something happen in my mind. It wasn't like hearing a voice exactly. It was more like understanding. A clear message formed in my consciousness. Leave me alone. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I do. I've spent nearly 3 decades trying to rationalize it. But in that moment, there was no doubt in my mind that this creature had somehow placed that thought there. The message came with emotions too, not aggression or threat, but a firm, clear boundary. Almost like how you might firmly tell a stranger not to come any closer. The creature's eyes held mine. They were dark but intelligent, deeply, unmistakably intelligent, not animal eyes, not human either, but something conscious, aware. I could see its breath in the cold air, coming in calm, measured puffs. My finger was on the safety of my rifle now, ready to flip it off. I was a hunter after all. But something stopped me. Looking into those eyes, I knew, absolutely knew, that shooting this creature would be wrong. It would be like shooting a person. The intelligence I saw there was unmistakable. For what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, we stared at each other. Then, with a deliberate motion, it dropped its arm from the branch, turned, and walked away into the deeper forest. It didn't run or scramble. It walked upright, just like a human would, disappearing into the trees with surprising silence for something so large. I stood there shaking. Not from fear exactly, though there was plenty of that. I was shaking because I knew I'd just witnessed something science said didn't exist. When I finally gathered myself enough to move, I approached the spot where it had stood. The ground there was mossy and soft, and the impressions left by its feet were clear. They matched the tracks I'd been following, roughly 17 inches long and about 5 to 6 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The depth of the impressions in the soft ground told me this thing was heavy. I'd later estimate maybe 600, 800 pounds. I noticed other details too. There were no broken branches where it had gripped the hemlock. It had been careful, deliberate in its movements. Despite its size, it had moved through the forest without crashing or breaking anything. That level of control and awareness wasn't animal-like. It was something else. By now, the sky was getting lighter. I took out my small pocket camera. I always carried it hunting to document any game, and took a few pictures of the footprints. Then I marked the location as best I could and headed back to camp. My hands were still shaking. Mike was up when I got back, boiling water for coffee on our small camp stove. He took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I told him everything. To his credit, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. Mike and I had been hunting together for over a decade. He knew I wasn't prone to making up stories or misidentifying wildlife. After breakfast, I took him back to the clearing. The footprints were still there, though starting to melt a bit as the day warmed up. Mike was silent as he examined them, measuring one with his hunting knife against the blade. 17 inches, give or take, he confirmed. Jesus, Dana. We followed the tracks for another half-mile or so before they disappeared where the ground became rocky. Mike wanted to keep searching, but I felt uneasy. That message, "Leave me alone," was still echoing in my mind. It didn't feel right to pursue it. We spent the rest of the day in a kind of daze, going through the motions of hunting, but not really focused on it. That night by the campfire, we talked about what to do with what I'd seen. "People will think you're crazy," Mike said, poking at the fire with a stick. "You know that, right?" I did know. Even as I sat there, I was already questioning myself. Had I imagined the telepathic message? Was it just my own thoughts, my own conscience stopping me from shooting? But I couldn't explain away what I'd seen. The creature itself was real. The footprints were real. Mike had seen those too. We decided to cut our trip short and headed back the next morning. Before we left, I returned to the clearing one last time. The footprints were mostly gone now, melted away in the morning sun. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. But it had happened. I know what I saw. Back home, I developed the photos I'd taken. They showed the footprints clearly enough, but without scale or context. They weren't particularly convincing evidence. I still have them somewhere, tucked away in an old album. I didn't go public with my story. In the mid-90s, before the internet was big, there weren't many places to share such experiences anyway. I told a few close friends, most of whom reacted with polite skepticism. I contacted one researcher who'd written books about Sasquatch sightings, but he seemed more interested in adding my story to his collection than in investigating it further. Over the years, I've thought a lot about what happened that morning, about those eyes, about that message in my head. I've read about other encounters, some similar to mine, others wildly different. I don't know what to make of all of them. I only know what I experienced. I've returned to Atollon Island a few times since then, though never to hunt, just to hike, to look. I've never seen the creature again, though sometimes in the deep woods I get a feeling of being watched that makes the hair on my neck stand up. What stayed with me most over these 29 years isn't the fear or the shock of seeing something that supposedly doesn't exist. It's the intelligence I saw in those eyes, the clear communication I felt. Whatever I encountered that morning wasn't just some animal. It was something thinking, aware, and intentional. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw on Atollon Island in October of 1994. I know what I felt when those eyes met mine, and no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget that connection, brief as it was, with something that science says isn't real. Sometimes at night, I still wake up thinking about those eyes, about that message, about what other impossible things might be out there in the wilderness, just beyond the edge of what we know. Story 13. I've gone back and forth about sharing this for years now. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it still bothers me, especially when I'm alone in the dark. This happened in August 2006, and I swear every detail is exactly how I remember it. My brother-in-law Mike and I were driving east on Lucia Falls Road in Clark County, Washington. It was around 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and we were heading back from a fishing trip. Mike's a medic with the fire department, and I've been hunting since I was 12. Just giving you some background so you understand we're not the type to scare easily or make up stories. We were about 15 minutes from home when I spotted what looked like a shooting star, except it was moving way too slow. Mike saw it too and pulled over onto the shoulder. We both got out and watched this light moving across the sky. "That's weird," Mike said. "Almost looks like a small plane going down." The light disappeared behind some trees about half a mile away. We didn't hear any crash, but Mike being Mike, he immediately went into rescue mode. "We should check it out. Someone could be hurt." I agreed, and we drove down the road until we found a spot to pull off near the railroad tracks that run parallel to Lucia Falls Road. It was dark as hell out there, no streetlights, just the moon providing some light through the trees. We grabbed our phones. This was 2006, so no smartphone flashlights, and the one small mag light Mike had in his glove compartment. "I'll head north along the tracks," Mike said. "You head south. If you find anything, yell. If not, meet back here in 30 minutes. That was the plan. Simple enough. I headed south along the railroad tracks with this dinky little light that barely illuminated 10 feet in front of me. The woods were thick on both sides, and it was that kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. You know when it's so silent you can hear your own heartbeat? That kind of quiet. After about 20 minutes of walking, I hadn't found anything. No plane, no debris, nothing unusual. I was starting to think maybe we'd seen a meteor or something, and was about to turn back when I heard rustling in the brush to my right. I stopped and pointed my light toward the sound. "Hello? Anybody there?" No response, just more rustling. I figured it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, so I continued walking, but the rustling seemed to follow me. I stopped again, and the rustling stopped too. That's when I started getting a weird feeling in my gut, like something wasn't right. I decided to head back to the truck. The woods were giving me the creeps, and I was thinking maybe Mike had found something and was waiting for me. On my way back, I kept hearing that rustling sound, always just off to my right in the trees, always stopping when I stopped. By the time I got back to where we'd parked, Mike wasn't there. I checked my watch. I'd been gone about 40 minutes, a bit longer than we'd agreed on. I figured he was still searching. Maybe he'd found something and was investigating. I waited by the truck for about 10 minutes, and that's when I realized I could use the truck's headlights to search better than with this crappy flashlight. So I unlocked the truck, jumped in, and started it up. That's when I saw it in my peripheral vision. What looked like a large man standing about 30 yards away at the edge of the tree line. When I turned to look directly, whatever it was stepped back into the shadows. "Mike!" I called out, but no answer. I turned on the headlights, and they illuminated the road and the first few rows of trees, but I didn't see anyone. I honked the horn twice, thinking maybe Mike would hear it and head back. Then I grabbed the flashlight again and decided to look for him. I was nervous about leaving the truck, but I was more worried about Mike. What if he was hurt? What if he'd found someone from the crash who needed medical attention? So I got out, locked the truck, force of habit, and started walking north along the tracks, the direction Mike had gone. I'd walked maybe a quarter mile when I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I spun around, but my flashlight was dying, and all I could see were shadows. The footsteps stopped. "Mike, that you?" No answer, just the sound of breathing, heavy breathing that wasn't mine. I stood there frozen, trying to make out shapes in the darkness. The moon had gone behind clouds, and without it, I couldn't see more than a few feet clearly. But I could feel something watching me. My skin was crawling with that feeling you get when someone's staring at you. Then the clouds shifted, and moonlight filtered through the trees. And that's when I saw it. Standing about 20 feet away was... I don't even know how to describe it properly. It was shaped like a man, but way too big. At least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and it was covered in dark hair or fur. Not like a costume, like actual hair growing from its skin. Its shoulders were massive, probably twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small guy. I'm 6'2", and about 220, and this thing made me feel tiny. I couldn't make out its face clearly. It was too dark, and honestly I didn't want to see it. But I could see the outline of its head, huge and somewhat pointed at the top, and I could see its eyes catching the moonlight. They reflected like an animal's eyes do when you shine a light at night. For what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, we just stood there staring at each other. I couldn't move. I've been hunting since I was a kid, faced down bears, been in some sketchy situations, but I have never felt fear like that. It was primal. Every cell in my body was screaming danger, but I was completely frozen. Then it shifted its weight and I heard a grunt. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. I ran through brush, stumbled over logs, fell down a small embankment, got up and kept running. I could hear it behind me, not running, but moving, breaking branches, heavy footsteps. I don't know how long I ran or how far. I just remember eventually realizing I'd lost my flashlight and my phone during the fall. I was completely lost, scratched up and bleeding from my hands and face where I'd hit branches and thorns. But I couldn't stop. I kept moving, trying to be quieter now, listening for any sounds of pursuit. Finally, I saw lights through the trees, headlights. I made my way toward them, praying it was Mike in our truck and not some stranger who'd think I was crazy. When I broke through the tree line, I nearly collapsed with relief. It was our truck, and Mike was standing beside it, looking worried and shining his flashlight into the woods. "John, where the hell have you been?" he shouted when he saw me. "Jesus, what happened to you?" I was a mess, covered in dirt, blood trickling from cuts on my hands and face, clothes torn from crashing through the underbrush. I could barely speak. I was so out of breath and terrified. "We need to go," was all I could say at first. "We need to go right now." Mike grabbed my shoulders. "Calm down. What happened? Did you find something?" I looked back toward the woods, half expecting to see that thing emerging from the trees. "There's something out there, Mike, something big." "What, like a bear?" he asked, immediately going into assessment mode, checking my cuts. I shook my head. "No, not a bear. It was like a man, but huge, covered in hair, standing upright. I could see the look in his eyes. He thought I was in shock or delirious. "Let's get you in the truck," he said. "You're bleeding pretty bad from that cut on your forehead." As he helped me into the passenger seat, I kept watching the tree line. "I'm not making this up, Mike. I'm not crazy. I saw something out there." "I believe you saw something," he said carefully. "But it's dark. You were alone. Maybe fell and hit your head." "I saw it before I fell," I insisted. "It was watching me, following me." Mike got in the driver's seat and started the truck. As the headlights swept across the trees, I flinched, half expecting to see that figure illuminated. But there was nothing. As we drove away, I told Mike everything. The rustling that followed me, seeing what looked like a man by the truck, the encounter on the railroad tracks, the massive size of the thing, the hair covering its body, the way its eyes reflected in the moonlight. "I've been hunting these woods for 20 years, I said. "I know every animal that lives here. This wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a moose or an elk. It was something else." Mike was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "When I was searching, I heard something weird, too. Heavy footsteps breaking branches. I thought it was you at first, but it seemed too loud. Then I got this feeling, like I was being watched, made the hair on my neck stand up. I headed back to the truck after that." We didn't say much else on the drive home. My wife freaked out when she saw the state I was in. Mike told her I'd fallen down an embankment while we were looking for what we thought was a crashed plane. He didn't mention what I'd seen, and I was grateful for that. I knew how it would sound. The next morning, after barely sleeping, I convinced Mike to go back with me in daylight. I had to know if there was any evidence of what I'd encountered. We brought better flashlights this time, and a first aid kit, and Mike brought his service pistol, though he didn't say why. We spent 3 hours searching the area. Found where I'd fallen down the embankment. My phone was there, screen shattered but otherwise intact. Found my flashlight too, but we found no evidence of a plane crash and no tracks or signs of the creature I'd seen. No broken branches big enough to indicate something huge had passed through. Nothing. "Maybe you did hit your head," Mike suggested gently as we were leaving. "But I know what I saw. I've replayed it in my mind thousands of times over the years. Sometimes I convince myself it was just shadows and fear, and maybe a concussion. But then I remember the feeling, that absolute terror that went beyond rational thought. The sound of its breathing, the way it just stood there, watching me, the way it moved through the forest behind me. I haven't gone back to those woods since. I've never told this story to anyone except Mike, and now you guys. Mike and I don't talk about it anymore. I think he wants to believe me, but it's easier to think I was just confused in the dark. But here's the thing that still haunts me. Whatever I saw that night, it was intelligent. It wasn't just some animal reacting on instinct. It followed me. It watched me. It waited. And when I ran, it pursued. Not in a straight charge like a predator, but deliberately, like it was herding me. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, hearing those heavy footsteps and breathing outside my window. My wife says it's just nightmares from the trauma of getting lost and hurt in the woods. Maybe she's right, but deep down, I know what I saw that night was real. And sometimes I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting, and that someday I might see those eyes again reflecting in the darkness. Story 14. I work for the local fisheries department, have been for about 8 years. My co-workers call me Joe. It's not my real name, but it stuck after I won the department fishing derby 3 years in a row. The Upper Kalama has always been my sanctuary, my escape from the noise and stress of everyday life. I know those woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. Last Friday, I decided to take a solo camping trip up to one of my favorite spots about 12 miles up the river. It's a small clearing I discovered a few years back, perfect for a one-man camp, flat ground, close to fresh water, and far enough from the main trails that you rarely see another soul. The weather forecast looked good. Clear skies, mild temperatures, perfect fishing conditions. I packed my gear Thursday night, my Coleman tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, fishing tackle, and enough food for 3 days. I even splurged on a new camp chair and a top-of-the-line cooler a few months back. All told, probably about $1,500 worth of equipment. I left early Friday morning around 6 a.m., taking my trail bike up to the area. The ride was peaceful, just me and the morning mist hanging over the river. I arrived at my spot around 8:30, set up camp, and spent the morning fishing. Caught a couple of decent-sized trout that I planned to cook for dinner. Everything was normal. Birds chirping, occasional rustling from small animals in the underbrush. Typical forest sounds I've heard 1,000 times before. As the day went on, I noticed something odd. The usual forest chatter started to die down. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals go quiet sometimes when weather's changing or when predators are around. Nothing unusual about that. By late afternoon, I had gathered plenty of firewood, set up my tent, and was settling in for what I thought would be a relaxing evening by the fire. The sun started setting around 7:30. I had my fire going strong, the trout cooking over the flames, and a cold beer in hand. This is usually my favorite time, just me, the crackling fire, and the stars beginning to peek through the treetops. But something felt off. I can't explain it exactly. Just this weird heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere had shifted. At first, I heard what sounded like movement in the underbrush, maybe 30 yards from my campsite, just beyond the ring of light from my fire. I figured it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon curious about my camp. But then the sounds stopped abruptly. Not like an animal moving away, but like something had deliberately stopped moving. Like it was watching me. I called out, "Hello? Somebody there?" Part of me was worried it might be another camper or hunter, and I wanted to make sure they knew I was there. No response. Just this thick, uncomfortable silence. I tried to shake it off, focus on my dinner, but I couldn't help glancing toward that spot every few minutes. The feeling of being watched was intense. I've spent enough time in these woods to know when something doesn't feel right, and all my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. Around 9 p.m., once it was fully dark, I heard it. A low, rumbling grunt from the same direction as the movement earlier. Not a bear grunt, not an elk. I've heard both plenty of times. This was different, deeper almost, deliberate. The hair on my arms stood up immediately. I added more wood to the fire, building it up higher than I normally would. Something told me I needed the light, needed the fire to be big. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound, but all I could see were shadows dancing between the trees. Nothing definitive, but the shadows seemed to shift as my light hit them, like something ducked away. Another grunt, this time from a slightly different location, maybe 40 yards to the left of the first one. Then the sound of heavy breathing. Not labored, but deep, powerful breaths. I've been around black bears and even had a run-in with a mountain lion once, but this didn't sound like either. The breathing was too controlled, too rhythmic. "Who's there?" I called out again, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got bear spray and I'm armed." I wasn't actually armed, haven't felt the need to carry a gun in these woods, but the bear spray wasn't a lie. Not that it made me feel any safer in that moment. The next sound froze my blood. A loud crack of a tree limb breaking, not like someone stepping on a twig, but like something had snapped a branch the thickness of my wrist, then another and another. Methodical, deliberate breaking sounds, like whatever was out there wanted me to hear it. I'm not sure how to describe what happened next without sounding crazy. The footsteps began. Heavy, slow footsteps circling my campsite just beyond the firelight. Not the 4-beat pattern of a bear or deer, but 2 distinct footfalls, bipedal. Human-like, except no human I know makes the ground shake like that with each step. I stayed put, sitting as close to the fire as I could without burning myself. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open another log to throw on the flames. The walking continued, circling my camp, never coming closer, but never leaving. Occasionally, there would be another grunt or a deep exhalation that seemed to come from high up, much higher than my own height. Around midnight, I heard more wood breaking, but this time it wasn't from the ground. It was from overhead, branches being snapped from standing trees. I shined my flashlight up and caught a glimpse of movement about 8 feet off the ground. Whatever was breaking those branches had to be tall, really tall. I considered making a run for it, jumping on my trail bike and getting the hell out of there. But something told me that's exactly what it wanted, to get me away from the fire, away from the light. So I stayed put, feeding the fire constantly, keeping the flames as high as possible. I'd never been so grateful for overpacking firewood in my life. The night dragged on endlessly. Every time I thought the thing might have left, there would be another grunt, another broken branch, another heavy footstep to remind me it was still there, still watching. I kept checking my watch. 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., each hour crawling by in a terrified blur. At one point, probably around 3:30, something hit the back of my tent. Not hard, more like a gentle push or prod, but it was enough to make me nearly jump out of my skin. I spun around, flashlight in one hand, bear spray in the other, but saw nothing. Just my tent canvas moving slightly as if disturbed by a breeze, except there was no breeze that night. The air was completely still. I started talking out loud, not to whatever was out there, but to myself. Just to hear a human voice, to remind myself I wasn't losing my mind. It's okay. Just a few more hours till daylight. Keep the fire going. You're fine. Looking back, I probably sounded like a lunatic, but it helped keep me focused, kept the panic from completely taking over. Around 4 a.m., the woods went completely silent. Even the normal night sounds, insects, the distant hooting of owls, all stopped. The silence was almost worse than the sounds had been. At least when I could hear it moving, I knew where it was. Now, it could have been anywhere. I don't think I blinked for the next hour. My eyes burned from staring into the darkness, straining to catch any movement, any sign of whatever had been stalking my camp. My back was pressed against a log, fire in front of me, flashlight clutched in my white-knuckled grip. When the first hint of dawn finally started lightening the sky around 5:30, I nearly cried with relief. As soon as there was enough light to see clearly, maybe around 6 a.m., I made my decision. I wasn't waiting around to see what had been circling my camp all night. I didn't care about my expensive gear. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. I grabbed only what I absolutely needed, my keys, wallet, phone, and water bottle, and made a beeline for my trail bike. I didn't look back, didn't stop to break down my tent or pack up my cooler. Just started the bike and tore out of there as fast as I could safely manage on the rough trail. The whole ride back, I kept expecting something to burst out of the trees, to cut me off or grab me from behind. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, almost drowning out the sound of the bike engine. But nothing happened. I made it back to the main road and didn't slow down until I hit the outskirts of town. When I got home, I sat in my truck for almost 20 minutes, just trying to process what had happened, trying to make sense of it. I knew I couldn't leave my gear up there, not just because of the cost, but because I didn't want anyone thinking I was missing or lost if they came across an abandoned campsite. I called 2 friends who live nearby, both experienced hunters who know the area well, and asked if they'd help me retrieve my stuff. I made up some story about feeling sick and having to leave in a hurry. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. They're good guys, but I didn't want them thinking I'd lost my mind. They went up later that day and brought back all my equipment. When they returned, they had a strange look on their faces. They asked me if I'd seen anyone else up there, if there had been other campers around. I told them no, asked why they were asking. That's when they showed me the pictures on their phones. All around my campsite, clearly visible in the daylight, were footprints. Huge, human-like footprints, 12 to 14 inches long at least, pressed deep into the soft earth. They circled the entire perimeter of where I'd been camping, exactly where I'd heard the footsteps during the night. And the broken branches they found weren't just on the ground. Many were still attached to the trees, snapped and hanging down, some as high as 8 to 10 feet off the ground. Way too high for a bear to reach, especially standing on that soft ground without leaving different types of tracks. My friends kept asking questions, looking at me sideways like they thought I was playing some kind of joke on them. But they could see on my face that I wasn't laughing. One of them finally said what I think we were all thinking, "These look like Bigfoot tracks, man." I've never believed in that stuff. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. Always thought it was just stories, misidentified bears, or people with overactive imaginations. Now I don't know what to believe. All I know is what I experienced, what I heard, and what my friends found afterward. It's been 5 days, and I still jump at every noise outside my window. I've cancelled my plans for this weekend's fishing trip. For the first time in my life, I'm afraid of the woods, afraid of the wilderness I've always loved. I've spent hours online looking up similar encounters in the area, found more stories than I expected from the upper Kalama River region. My co-workers have noticed something's wrong. I've made excuses about not feeling well, about stress. I can't bring myself to tell them. What would I even say? That I spent a night being stalked by something I never even clearly saw? That I abandoned $1,500 worth of camping gear because I was scared of the dark? I don't know if I'll ever go back to that spot, or if I'll ever camp alone again. The Upper Kalama has always been my favorite place in the world, my sanctuary. Now it feels tainted, dangerous. I keep telling myself that maybe it was just a bear, that fear magnified ordinary forest sounds into something more sinister. But then I remember those footprints, those deliberately broken branches, that methodical bipedal walking pattern. Whatever was in those woods that night, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I've encountered before in 15 years of outdoor experience. And it knew exactly what it was doing, testing me, scaring me, letting me know I was in its territory. The most terrifying part? I think the fire was the only thing keeping it at bay. If I'd fallen asleep, if I'd let that fire die down, I honestly don't think I'd be here writing this. Story 15. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. Honestly, part of me hopes you don't, because then I can pretend it didn't happen either, but I need to get this off my chest. For context, I used to own a small tackle shop near the Kalama River in Washington. Nice little business. And I supplemented my income by guiding fishing trips. I knew that river like the back of my hand, every hole, every riffle, every snag. Beginner's Hole was a spot I took clients to constantly, day and night. It's a popular fishing area, not too technical, good for newbies, hence the name, but also holds some decent fish if you know what you're doing. The weird shit started last September. I had a couple, Steve and Tasha, booked for a pre-dawn start. They'd driven up from Portland the night before and slept in their SUV at the pullout near Beginner's Hole. I showed up around 4:30 a.m. and found them wide awake, pale-faced and jumpy. Steve rolled down his window when I pulled up. "Something happened," he said immediately. His voice was shaking. "What's wrong?" I asked. Tasha leaned across from the passenger seat. Around 3 a.m., something hit the driver's window so hard we thought it would break, like wham! She slapped her hands together for emphasis. It wasn't a branch or a rock. The whole car shook. Steve nodded. I shot up and clicked on my flashlight, but there was nothing there. Whatever it was gone. Fast. But I swear to God, right before it hit, I saw a shadow. Something big. I chalked it up to a deer, maybe an elk. They're common enough. We still fished that morning, but they were on edge the whole time, constantly scanning the tree line. They didn't rebook. A week later, I was opening the shop when this guy Jason burst in, all wild-eyed and out of breath. He was a regular experienced angler, not prone to bullshit. He'd been at Beginner's Hole for an early morning session. "I'm never fishing that spot again," he blurted out, hands still trembling as he gripped my counter. "What happened?" "I was wading, about knee-deep, working that seam near the far bank. You know the spot." I nodded. The sun wasn't fully up yet, still misty on the water. I heard something in the brush on the bank, figured it was a deer coming down for a drink. He paused to take a deep breath. "It wasn't a deer, man. I looked up and there was... Christ, I don't even want to say it." He ran his hand through his hair. "It was standing there, on the bank, just watching me." "What was?" "A fucking Sasquatch. Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. 7 feet tall at least, covered in dark hair, standing there on 2 legs, watching me fish." I almost laughed, but Jason's face stopped me. He was legitimately terrified. "It was real," he insisted. "I dropped my rod and backed away and it just watched me. Didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. Then I turned and ran back to my truck." I didn't know what to say. Jason was a no-nonsense guy, an accountant from Vancouver, not the type to make up stories. He left without buying anything, and I haven't seen him in the shop since. I'd be lying if I said these stories didn't get to me, but I had a business to run. I kept taking clients to Beginner's Hole because, honestly, it was one of the best spots on the river, especially for beginners. About 3 weeks after Jason's visit, my beer distributor, Travis, wanted to go night fishing after he finished his delivery. We were friends, so I agreed to take him to, you guessed it, Beginner's Hole. It was around 9 p.m. when we got there, dark, but with a decent moon. We waded in about waist deep and started fishing the run. We'd been there maybe 45 minutes when we heard it. A massive splash from upstream, like something big had jumped or fallen into the water. Not a fish splash. This was heavy, like someone had pushed a refrigerator into the river. "What the hell was that?" Travis whispered, clicking on his headlamp and pointing it upstream. "Probably just a log breaking loose from the bank," I said, not believing it myself. "That wasn't a log," Travis replied. "Logs don't jump." We stood there for a minute, scanning with our lights, but saw nothing. Then we heard splashing, like something moving through the water toward us. Travis was out of there before I could even react. "Nope, I'm done," he called back, already halfway to shore. I followed him, not wanting to be left alone. When we reached the bank, Travis was already throwing his gear in my truck. "You telling me you didn't hear that? Something was coming right at us." He was genuinely scared. I tried to play it cool. Probably just a beaver or something. Bullshit. Beavers don't make splashes that big. He slammed my truck door. "Take me back to my car, man. I'm not staying here." I didn't argue. The splash had unnerved me too, though I wasn't ready to admit it. A few days later, I went back to Beginner's Hole alone during daylight. I told myself I needed to face whatever irrational fear was building up. It was a beautiful October afternoon, and I had the place to myself. I fished for a couple hours without incident, even relaxed a bit, thinking maybe all this weirdness was just in my head. I was about to call it a day when I heard it. Rocks splashing into the water from the far bank. Now, rock throwing isn't unusual near fishing spots. Kids do it, hikers do it, but there's a service road on the other side, not really accessible to the public. I looked over and saw nothing. Then another rock splashed, bigger this time. "Hello?" I called out. No response. Then another rock and another. They weren't being skipped. They were being thrown with force into the deepest part of the hole. I was getting annoyed, thinking maybe some local kids were messing with me. "Very funny," I shouted. "You're spooking the fish." That's when I heard it. A low, deep moan that seemed to start in the ground and rise up through the trees. It built in intensity until it morphed into a high-pitched scream that made the hair on my arms stand up. I've heard elk bugle, cougars scream, bears roar. This wasn't any of those, not even close. Whatever made that sound then moved through the trees on the far bank. Fast. Too fast for a person. I could track its movement by the shaking branches and cracking twigs, and it was covering ground at an impossible speed. I reeled in so fast, I tangled my line, threw everything in my pack, and got the hell out of there. I sat in my truck for a good 10 minutes, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. I couldn't. I should have stopped guiding at Beginner's Hole after that. I should have listened to my gut, but I had a business to run, and I'd already booked a father and son from Seattle for a night fishing trip that weekend. I decided that 3 of us with headlamps and flashlights would be fine. Safety in numbers, right? We arrived around 8 p.m. Tom and his 19-year-old son Mike were excited, never having fished for steelhead at night before. I took them to the usual spot, helped them set up with glow-in-the-dark bobbers and some bait. The fishing was slow, but they were enjoying the experience. Around 10:30 p.m., Mike's bobber suddenly dipped. "I got something!" he shouted, setting the hook. Whatever took his bait immediately started pulling with incredible strength. His drag was screaming. "Easy, easy," I coached. "Could be a big one. Let it run if it wants to." The fish, or whatever it was, pulled so hard that Mike was having trouble keeping his footing in the current. I waded over to help him. Tom shined his powerful flashlight on the water, trying to spot what his son had hooked. "I can't hold it," Mike said, struggling with the rod. The drag continued to scream as line peeled out. That's when it happened. About 30 yards downstream, something stood up in the middle of the river. I need to be absolutely clear here. The water at Beginner's Hole is about 4.5 feet at its deepest. Whatever stood up was in waist-deep water. It was massive, broad-shouldered, covered in what looked like dark fur. In the beam of Tom's flashlight, we could see it swinging its arms, trying to free itself. Mike's line led right to it. The hook was caught in its shoulder. "What the fuck is that?" Tom shouted, his light shaking as his hand trembled. Mike's rod bent nearly double. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. The creature was thrashing now, still not making a sound, just desperately trying to get the hook out. "Cut the line," I finally managed to say. "Cut the goddamn line." But before Mike could react, the creature gave one massive jerk, and the line snapped. For 3 terrifying minutes it had been hooked. 3 minutes of us staring at something that shouldn't exist. After breaking free, it didn't run away. It looked right at us. I swear to God it looked right at us. Then it bent its knees and dove underwater. We expected it to surface, to swim to shore, to do something normal. It didn't. It swam downstream, underwater, without coming up for air. We tracked its movement by the disturbance on the surface until it disappeared around the bend, at least 200 yards away. None of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. Tom finally broke the silence. "We need to go, now!" We practically ran to shore, tripping over rocks, not caring that we were soaking ourselves. No one wanted to be the last one in that water. We threw our gear in the truck without organizing it and got the hell out of there. During the drive back, Tom finally asked the question. "What was that?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Bullshit," he said. "You know exactly what that was. We all do." I didn't argue. What could I say? That we'd hooked a Sasquatch? That Bigfoot was real and apparently liked to swim in the Kalama River? I refunded their money and never heard from them again. That was 6 months ago. I sold the tackle shop 2 months later. Couldn't bring myself to guide anymore, especially not at Beginner's Hole. I work on computers from home now. It's boring, but it's safe. I haven't told many people about this. Who would believe it? But I know what I saw standing in that river. I know what Jason saw on the bank. I know what scared Travis that night. I know what threw those rocks and made that ungodly sound. I still fish, but never alone, never at night, and never, ever at Beginner's Hole. Some places should just be left alone. I learned that the hard way.